Night settles softly over New York City, the kind of quiet that only arrives after the last trains have rattled underground and the streets begin to breathe more slowly. Streetlights glow like distant stars, reflecting off rain-dark pavement, and somewhere between those shadows and lights lived a man whose influence was rarely seen, but always felt. His name was Charles Lucky Luciano, and while others chased fame, headlines, and fearsome reputations, he chose something far more enduring. He chose structure. He chose order. And in doing so, he quietly redesigned the criminal underworld of America. Long before movies turned gangsters into larger-than-life figures, and long before the word Mafia became shorthand for mystery and menace, Luciano understood a simple truth: power does not need to announce itself. True power works best when it remains calm, organized, and almost invisible. While other men ruled through chaos and superstition, Luciano ruled through logic. His empire did not roar, it whispered. To understand Lucky Luciano, it helps to let go of the familiar images of fedora-wearing mob bosses barking orders in smoke-filled rooms. Luciano was not driven by theatrical cruelty or emotional vendettas. He did not believe in needless bloodshed, nor did he cling to ancient traditions simply because they were old. Instead, he viewed crime the way an executive views business: systems, efficiency, alliances, and long-term stability. That mindset would make him both revolutionary and dangerous. By the time his name began circulating through police files and courtroom testimony, Luciano was already far ahead of his pursuers. He had moved beyond street fights and neighborhood turf wars into something far more complex. He imagined a nationwide network of cooperation among criminal organizations, where profit mattered more than pride and where disputes were settled with words rather than bullets. This vision, radical for its time, laid the foundation for what would later be known as the modern American Mafia. But before the legend, before the power, and before the quiet authority that shaped decades of organized crime, Luciano was simply Salvatore Lucania, an immigrant child arriving in a foreign land with little more than instinct and ambition. His journey from the crowded docks of New York to the unseen throne of the underworld was not guided by destiny or luck alone. It was shaped by observation, adaptation, and a willingness to abandon the past in favor of something new. The early 20th century was a restless time in America. Cities expanded upward and outward, swelling with immigrants chasing opportunity. The streets were crowded, noisy, and often unforgiving. For young boys like Luciano, survival came early, and lessons were learned quickly. Strength mattered, but intelligence mattered more. Knowing who to trust, when to speak, and when to remain silent could mean the difference between progress and punishment. Luciano learned these lessons well. As he grew older, Luciano began to see patterns others ignored. He noticed how violence, when uncontrolled, attracted attention. He saw how personal grudges weakened entire organizations. Most importantly, he understood that tradition, when followed blindly, could become a liability. The older generation of mafia leaders clung tightly to old-world customs, enforcing rigid hierarchies and ethnic exclusivity. Luciano, however, believed America required a different approach. His vision was simple but bold: crime should adapt to its environment, just as any successful enterprise does. In America, that meant cooperation across ethnic lines, strategic planning instead of emotional reactions, and a clear structure that minimized internal conflict. Where others saw rivals, Luciano saw potential partners. Where others saw chaos, he saw opportunity. This mindset placed him on a collision course with the established order. The Mafia of Luciano's early years was ruled by men often referred to as the mustache Petes, old Sicilian bosses who valued secrecy, tradition, and personal authority above all else. To them, Luciano was dangerous not because he was violent, but because he questioned their way of life. He represented change, and change threatened their power. Yet Luciano was patient. He did not rush to overthrow the old guard. Instead, he watched, listened, and waited. He formed alliances quietly, most notably with Meyer Lansky, a partnership that would become one of the most important in criminal history. Together, they imagined a world where crime functioned less like feuding families and more like a boardroom, where disputes were negotiated, territories respected, and profits shared. As Prohibition descended upon America, banning alcohol and creating an enormous black market overnight, Luciano's ideas found their perfect testing ground. While others scrambled to claim territory through violence, Luciano focused on logistics. He organized supply chains, transportation routes, and distribution networks. He understood that the real money was not in controlling a single street or neighborhood, but in coordinating entire regions. By the early 1930s, his influence had grown immense, though few outside law enforcement fully grasped its scale. Luciano did not seek public recognition. He avoided flashy displays of wealth and power. Instead, he positioned himself as a mediator, a problem solver, a man whose approval could prevent wars and whose disapproval could quietly end careers. This subtle authority made him both respected and feared. Unlike the bosses who ruled through intimidation, Luciano ruled through necessity. People needed his system to function. Without it, chaos would return, and chaos was bad for business. In this way, Luciano became less a ruler and more an architect, designing a framework that others operated within. Yet for all his intelligence and restraint, Luciano was not immune to the weight of his own creation. Power, even when exercised quietly, carries consequences. Every alliance created new enemies. Every compromise required sacrifice. And every step toward order distanced him further from the simple survival instincts that once guided him as a boy on the streets. As we begin this journey through Lucky Luciano's life, it becomes clear that his story is not merely about crime. It is about transformation. It is about how one man's refusal to accept the old rules reshaped an entire hidden world. It is about the cost of intelligence in a violent environment, and the loneliness that comes with seeing the future before others are ready to follow. In the soft glow of streetlights and the hush of sleeping cities, Luciano's legacy lingers, not in gunshots or headlines, but in systems still studied, structures still copied, and organizations that continue to operate in the shadows he once arranged so carefully. And as the night deepens, the question remains, was Lucky Luciano a criminal who became powerful, or a strategist who happened to operate outside the law? The answer, like his empire, is quieter than expected, and far more complex. The journey begins far from the neon glow of American cities, in a land shaped by stone, sun, and centuries of hardship. Sicily at the turn of the 20th century was a place where survival depended on family, loyalty, and endurance. Villages clung to hillsides, fields stretched dry beneath the Mediterranean sky, and authority often felt distant or unreliable. For many Sicilian families, opportunity was a rumor carried on the wind, whispering of a distant country across the ocean where work was plentiful and futures could be rebuilt. It was in this world that Salvatore Lucania was born in 1897, unaware that his life would one day ripple far beyond the island that shaped his earliest years. Salvatore's family lived modestly, like so many others. Life was defined by labor and limitation, by routines passed down through generations. In Sicily, power was often informal and deeply personal. Local strongmen, landowners, and secret societies filled the gaps left by weak institutions. Children absorbed these realities without instruction. They learned who to respect, who to avoid, and when silence mattered more than truth. These early impressions would quietly settle into Salvatore's understanding of authority and control, even before he could name them. In 1906, when Salvatore was still a boy, his family joined the massive wave of Sicilian immigrants bound for the United States. The decision to leave was not driven by adventure but necessity. Economic hardship and limited opportunity made the future uncertain. The voyage across the Atlantic was long and uncomfortable, marked by crowded conditions and endless days of sea and sky. For young Salvatore, the journey itself became a lesson: endurance, patience, and the ability to adapt to unfamiliar surroundings. When the ship finally arrived in New York Harbor, the city must have felt overwhelming. The skyline rose sharply from the water, alive with movement and noise. Ellis Island processed thousands of immigrants each day, reducing complex lives into simple questions and stamped documents. Names were adjusted, accents softened, identities reshaped. Salvatore Lucania stepped onto American soil carrying both the weight of his past and the uncertainty of his future. The family settled in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a dense neighborhood packed with immigrants from all over Europe. The streets were narrow, crowded with pushcarts, shouting vendors, and children playing among the chaos. Buildings leaned close together, their windows glowing at night with lamplight and conversation. For newcomers, the Lower East Side was both a refuge and a challenge. It offered community, familiarity, and shared language, but it also demanded resilience. Life in these tenements was difficult. Apartments were small, often housing multiple families. Privacy was rare, and tempers were short. Children grew up quickly, navigating streets where opportunity and danger existed side by side. For Salvatore, school held little appeal. Like many immigrant children, he struggled with language and authority, and the need to contribute financially to the household soon outweighed formal education. The streets became his classroom. In this environment, strength alone was not enough. The neighborhood was a mosaic of ethnic groups, each with its own gangs and informal hierarchies. Respect had to be earned, and fear could not be shown. Salvatore learned to observe before acting, to listen before speaking. He watched older boys organize themselves, collecting money for protection, controlling corners and routes. These early street groups offered something the larger society did not, a sense of belonging and power. At a young age, Salvatore began running small errands for local gangs, carrying messages, watching for police, collecting coins from shopkeepers. These tasks were not glamorous, but they provided income and status. More importantly, they offered insight into how informal power operated. He saw how leaders maintained loyalty, how disputes were resolved, and how violence, when used sparingly, could reinforce authority rather than undermine it. As he grew into adolescence, Salvatore's personality began to sharpen. He was not the loudest or most aggressive, but he possessed a calm confidence that set him apart. He understood people, sensing their fears and motivations. This emotional intelligence allowed him to navigate conflicts without escalating them unnecessarily. While others relied on brute force, Salvatore relied on calculation. The contrast between the old world values his family carried and the new world realities he faced daily created a tension within him. At home, traditions were respected, elders deferred to, and Sicily remembered with nostalgia. On the streets, survival required flexibility and innovation. Rules were made and broken daily, and success favored those who adapted fastest. Salvatore absorbed both worlds, learning when to honor tradition and when to abandon it. The American dream, as advertised, remained distant. Factories offered long hours for little pay, and discrimination was common. Italian immigrants were often viewed with suspicion, labeled as outsiders, and excluded from mainstream opportunities. This exclusion pushed many young men toward alternative paths. For Salvatore, the underground economy offered not just money, but dignity and control over his destiny. By his mid-teens, Salvatore had already encountered the justice system. Minor arrests and run-ins with police were common in the neighborhood, almost a rite of passage. Each encounter reinforced his understanding of authority and its limits. He noticed how enforcement was uneven, how connections mattered, and how appearances could deceive. These experiences deepened his skepticism toward official power and strengthened his belief in self-made systems. It was during these formative years that Salvatore began to think beyond immediate gain. While others focused on quick profits or personal dominance, he started to recognize patterns. He saw how conflicts repeated themselves, how alliances shifted, and how inefficiency bred vulnerability. These observations planted the seeds of a broader vision, though it would take years for that vision to fully emerge. By the time Salvatore Lucania moved fully into his teenage years, the streets had stopped feeling chaotic and had begun to feel familiar. What once seemed overwhelming now appeared patterned, almost predictable. Every block had its rhythms, every corner its unspoken rules. He learned when the police patrols passed, which shopkeepers paid quietly, and which faces belonged to outsiders. Survival was no longer about reacting, it was about anticipating. And anticipation, Salvatore discovered, was a form of power. The neighborhood gangs of the Lower East Side were not yet the organized forces they would later become. They were loose collections of boys and young men, bound together by proximity rather than ideology. Fights erupted over territory, insults, or perceived disrespect. Most of the violence was impulsive, driven by pride and fear rather than strategy. Salvatore watched all of this carefully. He noticed how quickly leaders rose and fell, how recklessness attracted attention, and how loyalty often dissolved under pressure. Rather than chasing notoriety, Salvatore focused on usefulness. He made himself valuable by being reliable. He could be trusted to collect money without skimming, to deliver messages without altering them, and to keep his mouth shut when questions were asked. In an environment where betrayal was common, discretion became his currency. People began to notice that when Salvatore was involved, things tended to run more smoothly. Extortion, though brutal in nature, followed its own logic. Shopkeepers paid not just to avoid harm, but to gain predictability. Salvatore understood this distinction early on. Fear could compel payment once, but stability ensured long-term compliance. He encouraged restraint, arguing that a frightened shopkeeper was less profitable than a cooperative one. These ideas were subtle and often unspoken, but they influenced how operations were carried out around him. As his confidence grew, so did his responsibilities. He became involved in small thefts, gambling operations, and protection schemes. Each activity offered lessons in risk and reward. He saw how gambling attracted constant attention and how theft required careful planning to avoid unnecessary exposure. Through trial and error, Salvatore refined his instincts, learning when to push forward and when to pull back. Violence was an unavoidable part of this world, but Salvatore approached it differently. He did not shy away from confrontation, yet he avoided unnecessary brutality. When fights occurred, they were meant to resolve disputes, not inflame them. This approach earned him respect among peers who were tired of endless cycles of retaliation. Calm, in a world addicted to chaos, stood out. Encounters with law enforcement became more frequent as Salvatore's activities expanded. Arrests were usually for minor offenses, but each experience added to his understanding of the system. He observed how police pressure ebbed and flowed, how certain neighborhoods were targeted more aggressively than others, and how informants operated. He learned that information was as valuable as money, sometimes more so. It was during this period that Salvatore's reputation began to grow beyond his immediate surroundings. Word traveled quietly that he was someone who could be trusted, someone who thought before acting. Older criminals took notice, recognizing in him a level of maturity unusual for his age. Though still young, Salvatore began to move in circles where decisions carried heavier consequences. The streets also taught him about hierarchy. Leadership was not merely claimed, it was granted by those who benefited from it. Salvatore did not demand obedience. Instead, he created situations where cooperation made sense. People followed because it served their interests, not because they were forced. This distinction would later become central to his philosophy of power. Friendships formed in these years were often transactional, but some carried deeper significance. Bonds forged under pressure tended to last, especially when trust was earned rather than assumed. Salvatore learned who could be relied upon in difficult moments and who would disappear when risks increased. These early assessments of character would inform his alliances later in life. At the same time, Salvatore became increasingly aware of the limitations of street-level crime. The constant skirmishes, the narrow focus on territory, and the lack of coordination frustrated him. He began to imagine a different approach, one where conflicts were minimized and profits maximized through cooperation. These thoughts remained internal, shared only with a select few who showed similar inclinations. The city around him was changing rapidly. Immigration continued, neighborhoods shifted, and new opportunities emerged. The growth of nightlife, entertainment venues, and informal economies created fresh avenues for income. Salvatore paid attention to these trends, recognizing that crime, like legitimate business, had to evolve alongside its environment. By his late teens, Salvatore was no longer just participating in criminal activity, he was shaping it. He influenced how money was collected, how disputes were settled, and how risks were assessed. His presence brought a sense of order, even if fragile. Those who worked with him felt more secure, and that security translated into loyalty. Yet beneath this progress lay constant tension. Every decision carried the possibility of failure, arrest, or death. Friends were injured, imprisoned, or lost to reckless choices. These losses reinforced Salvatore's belief that emotional decision-making was dangerous. He resolved to distance himself from impulsive violence, viewing it as a weakness rather than a strength. The nickname, Lucky, began to circulate more widely during this time, often attributed to his ability to escape serious consequences. Whether by instinct or calculation, he seemed to avoid the fates that befell others. To some, this was luck. To Salvatore, it was the result of careful observation and restraint. As his ambitions expanded, so did his sense of detachment. He remained connected to the streets that raised him, but he no longer saw them as an endpoint. In the crowded streets of early 20th century New York, chance encounters often carried more weight than formal introductions. Alliances were not announced, they were discovered, slowly, through observation and shared experience. It was in this environment that Salvatore Lucania crossed paths with a young man who would come to understand him in a way few others ever could. His name was Meyer Lansky, and their meeting marked the beginning of one of the most consequential partnerships in the history of organized crime. Meyer Lansky was different from the men Salvatore was used to dealing with. He was smaller in stature, quieter, and more reserved. Where others relied on intimidation, Lansky relied on intellect. He had a sharp memory, a talent for numbers, and an instinct for probabilities that bordered on uncanny. To many, he appeared unremarkable, easily overlooked in a city full of louder personalities. But Salvatore noticed him almost immediately. Their early interactions were cautious. Trust was not given lightly, especially across ethnic lines. At the time, most criminal groups operated within rigid boundaries. Italians worked with Italians, Jews with Jews, and cooperation across those lines was rare and often discouraged. Old traditions warned that outsiders could not be trusted, that loyalty could only exist within shared blood and heritage. Salvatore, however, had already begun to question these assumptions. What drew him to Lansky was not friendship at first, but recognition. Salvatore sensed a familiar way of thinking. Lansky, like him, observed before acting. He calculated risk rather than rushing into it. He saw the city not as a battlefield, but as a complex system of opportunities and vulnerabilities. Conversations between the two often drifted away from immediate concerns and toward broader ideas, how operations could be improved, how conflicts could be avoided, and how money could move more efficiently. Their bond deepened through shared ventures, particularly in gambling. Gambling required structure, fairness, and discipline to succeed long-term. A crooked game might yield quick profits, but it destroyed trust and invited retaliation. Lansky understood this implicitly, and Salvatore appreciated the alignment. Together, they built operations that prioritized consistency over spectacle, ensuring steady income without attracting unnecessary attention. This partnership was revolutionary in its simplicity. By working together, they demonstrated that cooperation across ethnic lines was not only possible, but profitable. Their success challenged deeply ingrained beliefs within the underworld. Where others saw betrayal waiting to happen, Salvatore and Lansky saw mutual benefit. Each brought complementary strengths to the table, Salvatore with his leadership and street credibility, Lansky with his financial acumen and strategic thinking. As their operations expanded, so did their influence. They moved beyond neighborhood-level schemes, connecting networks and coordinating efforts across larger areas. This required trust on a scale that was uncommon at the time. Disputes were resolved through discussion rather than violence, a practice that puzzled and impressed those who witnessed it. Over time, this approach reduced internal friction and increased profits, reinforcing their belief that order was more powerful than fear. Their friendship was not sentimental. It was built on respect and shared vision rather than emotional attachment. Both men understood the risks of their world and the importance of discretion. They did not socialize unnecessarily, nor did they draw attention to their alliance. In public, they remained unassuming. In private, they planned. Through Lansky, Salvatore gained exposure to a broader network of Jewish gangsters, many of whom were similarly pragmatic and forward-thinking. This expanded circle included figures who would later play significant roles in national criminal enterprises. These connections allowed Salvatore to see beyond the insular world of Italian gangs, opening his mind to a more inclusive and flexible model of organization. This growing network also highlighted the inefficiencies of the existing mafia structure. Old leaders clung to hierarchy and tradition, often refusing to collaborate with capable outsiders. These limitations frustrated Salvatore, who increasingly viewed them as obstacles to progress. Through his partnership with Lansky, he found proof that a different approach could work, one that valued competence over ancestry. As the two men navigated the evolving criminal landscape, they remained careful not to provoke unnecessary hostility. Change, they understood, had to be introduced gradually. They avoided direct confrontations with established bosses, preferring to build parallel systems that demonstrated success without overt challenge. This subtlety allowed their influence to grow quietly, like roots spreading beneath the surface. Their discussions often turned philosophical. They spoke about the nature of power, the dangers of ego, and the importance of adaptability. Both believed that emotional decision-making was the enemy of longevity. Pride, they agreed, was a weakness exploited by rivals and authorities alike. In its place, they advocated for rationality and foresight. This alignment of values strengthened their bond and sharpened their ambitions. They began to envision a future where criminal organizations operated with the efficiency of legitimate businesses. In this future, wars would be avoided, profits stabilized, and leadership determined by ability rather than lineage. It was a radical vision, but one that felt increasingly attainable as their influence expanded. Their alliance also attracted attention, both positive and negative. Some admired their success and sought to emulate it. Others viewed their cooperation as a threat to established norms. Whispers circulated about a new kind of leadership emerging, one that did not respect old boundaries. These rumors reached the ears of traditional bosses, planting seeds of suspicion. Salvatore was aware of the risks. Aligning with Lansky and other non-Italian figures challenged deeply held beliefs within the Mafia. The world Salvatore Lucania was moving toward stood in sharp contrast to the one that currently ruled the Italian underworld. At the top of that older structure were men shaped almost entirely by Sicily, by villages where loyalty was inherited, where authority was unquestioned, and where tradition mattered more than results. These men were often called the Mustache Petes, a nickname that captured both their appearance and their mindset. They wore their old-world identity proudly, speaking in dialect, enforcing rituals, and clinging to customs that had survived centuries but were beginning to strain under the weight of modern America. To the Mustache Petes, the Mafia was not merely a business. It was a sacred inheritance. Rules were followed because they had always been followed. Bloodlines mattered. Outsiders were distrusted. Decisions were made slowly, often clouded by pride, superstition, and personal grudges. Respect was demanded, not earned, and violence was frequently used to reinforce authority rather than protect profit. For a long time, this system had worked well enough. But America was changing, and Salvatore could see cracks forming everywhere. From his vantage point on the streets of New York, Salvatore observed how these old bosses operated. They ruled through fear, surrounding themselves with loyalists who rarely questioned orders. But fear, he noticed, created distance. Men obeyed, but they did not think. They followed instructions, but they did not innovate. When problems arose, solutions were often emotional rather than strategic. A perceived insult could lead to bloodshed, and bloodshed invited attention. Attention, in turn, attracted law enforcement. Salvatore understood that tradition had value, but only when it served a purpose. Blind loyalty to the past, he believed, was dangerous. America was not Sicily. The scale was larger, the opportunities broader, and the risks far greater. Ethnic enclaves overlapped, commerce moved faster, and law enforcement was becoming more organized and aggressive. A system built for rural villages could not efficiently govern sprawling cities. The Mustache Petes resisted this reality. They viewed change as betrayal. To them, adapting meant weakening, and compromising tradition meant losing control. Salvatore's willingness to work with non-Italians, particularly Jewish associates like Meyer Lansky, was seen as heretical. The idea that profit should outweigh ancestry challenged the very foundation of their authority. Meetings with these older bosses were often tense. Salvatore listened more than he spoke, carefully choosing his words. He showed respect outwardly, understanding that direct confrontation would be suicidal. But inwardly, he catalogued their flaws. He saw leaders who mistook stubbornness for strength and ritual for wisdom. He saw organizations paralyzed by internal feuds and inefficiencies, bleeding resources over personal pride. One of the most dangerous aspects of the old system was its obsession with hierarchy. Titles mattered more than results. The concept of a single, boss of bosses, concentrated power in ways that invited resentment and rebellion. Salvatore recognized that no one man could effectively control an entire criminal landscape without eventually becoming a target. Centralized authority created fragile structures, easily destabilized by ambition and betrayal. In contrast, Salvatore imagined a decentralized system, one where power was shared, disputes were arbitrated, and leadership was flexible. Instead of constant wars over territory, there could be agreements. Instead of emotional vendettas, there could be negotiation. This was not weakness in his mind, it was efficiency. The Mustache Petes also underestimated law enforcement. Many believed that secrecy alone would protect them, relying on coded language, rituals, and intimidation. Salvatore saw otherwise. He watched as police methods improved, as prosecutors built cases patiently rather than impulsively. He understood that survival in this new era required adaptation, not denial. Despite these differences, Salvatore did not dismiss the old bosses entirely. He recognized their experience and the foundation they had built. His frustration was not with their past success, but with their refusal to evolve. He believed that honoring the spirit of the Mafia, mutual protection, loyalty, and profit, did not require clinging to outdated practices that endangered everyone involved. This ideological divide created an undercurrent of tension throughout the underworld. Younger criminals began to gravitate towards Salvatore's way of thinking, drawn by the promise of stability and growth. Older leaders sensed this shift and grew suspicious. They saw their influence waning, not through open rebellion, but through quiet migration of loyalty. Salvatore remained patient. He understood that revolutions did not begin with gunfire, they began with ideas. He allowed the old system to reveal its weaknesses, knowing that time was on his side. Every unnecessary killing, every poorly managed dispute, every law enforcement crackdown strengthened his argument without him needing to speak. Privately, Salvatore discussed these issues with trusted allies. Conversations with Meyer Lansky often returned to the same theme, tradition versus progress. Both men agreed that sentimentality was dangerous in a world driven by profit and risk. They spoke of building something new not out of disrespect for the past, but out of necessity for the future. As prohibition loomed on the horizon, Salvatore sensed that a reckoning was coming. The ban on alcohol would create unprecedented opportunities, and unprecedented chaos. The old bosses, with their rigid thinking and internal rivalries, were ill-prepared for the scale of what was about to unfold. Salvatore, on the other hand, saw prohibition as a test. Whoever adapted fastest would shape the next era. The Mustache Petes dismissed these concerns, confident in their authority. They believed that tradition would protect them as it always had. But tradition, Salvatore knew, could not move trucks, manage supply chains, or negotiate cross-border alliances. The future required planners, not just enforcers. When the United States chose to outlaw alcohol in 1920, the decision was meant to bring order and morality to a restless nation. Instead, it opened the door to an underground economy so vast and so profitable that it reshaped the criminal world overnight. For many, prohibition was chaos. For Salvatore Lucania, it was clarity. He did not see a moral crusade or a temporary inconvenience. He saw a market. And markets, no matter how illegal, followed predictable rules. Almost immediately, demand for alcohol surged rather than faded. Speakeasies appeared behind unmarked doors, in basements, back rooms, and quiet storefronts. Restaurants served drinks in teacups, and private clubs thrived in secrecy. The thirst of the public was relentless, and enforcement was inconsistent. This imbalance between demand and regulation created a perfect environment for organized crime to flourish. While many criminals rushed in with little planning, fighting over territory and hijacking shipments, Salvatore took a slower, more deliberate approach. He understood that alcohol distribution was not just about supply, it was about logistics. Where would the liquor come from? How would it be transported? Who would control storage, distribution, and retail? Each step required coordination, trust, and discipline. Salvatore began by strengthening relationships with existing suppliers, including smugglers who brought alcohol from Canada and the Caribbean. He focused on reliability rather than speed, preferring steady deliveries over risky large shipments that attracted attention. He invested in transportation networks, ensuring that routes were known only to those who needed to know. Redundancy was built into the system, so that no single arrest or seizure could cripple operations. At the same time, he worked closely with partners like Meyer Lansky, who excelled at managing finances and gambling operations. Lansky's understanding of numbers complemented Salvatore's organizational instincts. Together, they tracked profits, losses, and risks with precision. This attention to detail allowed them to reinvest intelligently, expanding operations without overextending. One of Salvatore's most important insights during this period was the value of cooperation over conquest. Instead of violently taking over territories, he negotiated. Agreements were made with other gangs, outlining boundaries, profit-sharing arrangements, and conflict resolution mechanisms. These pacts reduced violence and ensured that everyone benefited from the booming alcohol trade. This approach stood in stark contrast to the methods favored by many traditional bosses. The Mustache Petes often relied on intimidation and brute force, leading to frequent wars that disrupted business and attracted law enforcement. Salvatore, however, recognized that stability was more profitable than dominance. A peaceful neighborhood with predictable income was worth far more than a contested one soaked in blood. Speakeasy owners quickly learned the difference. Those under Salvatore's protection experienced fewer raids and more consistent supply. They paid their fees willingly, understanding that reliability was worth the cost. Word spread quietly, and demand for his protection increased. Power grew not through fear, but through reputation. As prohibition continued, Salvatore refined his system. He introduced layers of insulation between himself and street-level operations. Managers oversaw districts, and communication flowed through trusted intermediaries. This structure reduced his exposure and allowed him to focus on strategy rather than daily enforcement. It also made the organization more resilient, able to absorb losses without collapsing. Law enforcement posed a constant threat, but Salvatore approached it pragmatically. Bribery, while risky, was sometimes effective. More importantly, he emphasized discretion. Operations were designed to minimize visibility. Deliveries were scheduled during low-traffic hours, and venues rotated suppliers to avoid patterns. This adaptability kept authorities off balance. The sheer scale of the alcohol trade transformed the underworld. Money flowed in unprecedented amounts, funding expansion into gambling, prostitution, and other ventures. Salvatore ensured that profits were reinvested wisely, avoiding extravagant displays that attracted attention. He believed wealth was most powerful when it remained unseen. As his influence expanded, Salvatore became increasingly aware of the limitations of the existing mafia hierarchy. Prohibition required rapid decision-making and cross-territorial coordination, capabilities the old system struggled to provide. Meetings dragged on, rivalries flared, and inefficiencies multiplied. Salvatore's operations, by contrast, moved with quiet efficiency. This success did not go unnoticed. Younger criminals gravitated toward his model, seeing in it a path to stability and growth. Older bosses grew wary, sensing a shift in the balance of power. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, fueled by jealousy and fear of obsolescence. Salvatore remained cautious. He understood that open defiance would provoke retaliation. Instead, he continued to build alliances, positioning himself as a mediator and problem solver. When disputes arose, he offered solutions that benefited all parties, reinforcing his reputation as a stabilizing force. Prohibition also forced Salvatore to think nationally. Alcohol routes crossed state lines, and coordination was essential. He collaborated with criminal organizations in other cities, sharing information and resources. These connections laid the groundwork for a broader network that extended far beyond New York. Throughout this period, Salvatore's philosophy crystallized. Crime, he believed, should function like a business, guided by logic and foresight. Violence was a tool, not a strategy. Tradition was respected, but not worshipped. Adaptation was the key to survival. As the decade progressed, it became clear that Prohibition had done more than create opportunity, it had accelerated change. The old ways were being tested, and many were failing. Salvatore's system, built on cooperation and efficiency, was thriving. Yet success brought new challenges. The more profitable the operation, the greater the scrutiny. Rivals plotted, authorities adapted, and internal pressures mounted. Salvatore knew that the balance he had achieved was fragile. Maintaining it would require not just intelligence, but decisive action. As the nation continued its uneasy experiment with temperance, Salvatore Lucania stood at the center of a quietly expanding empire. He had turned a moral crusade into a logistical triumph, proving that order could emerge from chaos. But beneath the calm surface, tensions were building, and the choices ahead would demand more than careful planning. They would demand courage, and a willingness to reshape the underworld forever. As the flow of money from Prohibition continued to swell, Salvatore Lucania found himself standing at a crossroads few men ever reached. He had mastered the streets, navigated the traditions of the old mafia, and exploited the vast opportunities created by illegal alcohol. But success at this scale demanded something more than instinct or alliances. It demanded structure. What Salvatore began to build during this period was not merely a criminal operation, but a system, one designed to endure beyond individual personalities, grudges, or moments of violence. The key insight guiding him was simple yet revolutionary: chaos was expensive. Every gunfight disrupted supply lines. Every internal feud drew attention. Every impulsive decision risked exposure. Salvatore believed that crime, like any enterprise, could be organized to reduce waste and increase profit. This belief set him apart from nearly every other major figure in the underworld at the time. He began by redefining roles within his organization. Instead of loosely defined crews competing for favor, he introduced clear responsibilities. Certain men focused solely on transportation, others on storage, others on distribution. Financial oversight was centralized, often under the watchful eye of trusted associates like Meyer Lansky. This specialization improved efficiency and reduced misunderstandings that often led to conflict. Communication was another area Salvatore reimagined. He understood that information was both power and liability. Too much communication created risk, too little bred confusion. Messages were streamlined, passed only through trusted channels. Meetings were purposeful and limited in size. Decisions were recorded mentally rather than on paper, reducing the chance of evidence falling into the wrong hands. Perhaps most significantly, Salvatore changed how disputes were handled. Traditionally, disagreements over territory or profit often escalated into violence. Salvatore viewed this as a failure of leadership. He encouraged negotiation, mediation, and compromise. When conflicts arose, neutral parties were brought in to arbitrate. The goal was resolution, not revenge. This approach required discipline, and not everyone was comfortable with it. Some saw restraint as weakness, equating authority with aggression. Salvatore addressed this by emphasizing results. Those who followed the new system prospered. Those who clung to old habits found themselves sidelined or isolated. Gradually, behavior changed, not through force, but through incentive. As the system expanded, Salvatore ensured it remained flexible. He avoided rigid hierarchies that concentrated too much power in one place. Instead, he favored a network structure, where leaders operated semi-independently within agreed boundaries. This decentralization reduced vulnerability. If one node failed, the others could continue functioning. Trust remained a cornerstone of this emerging syndicate. Salvatore was selective in choosing lieutenants, favoring reliability over ambition. He believed unchecked ambition was destabilizing. Loyalty, once earned, was rewarded with autonomy and protection. Betrayal, however, was dealt with swiftly and decisively, reinforcing the seriousness of the system. Financial transparency within the organization was another innovation. While secrecy from outsiders was paramount, internal clarity prevented disputes. Profits were divided according to agreed terms, and contributions were tracked. This reduced resentment and suspicion, fostering a sense of shared purpose. As these principles took hold, Salvatore's influence spread beyond his immediate circle. Other criminal groups began adopting similar practices, often informally. Cooperation between organizations increased, as leaders recognized the benefits of stability. This web of alliances formed the early framework of what would later be known as the National Crime Syndicate. Salvatore's role within this network was unique. He did not present himself as a king or supreme boss. Instead, he positioned himself as a coordinator, a facilitator. His authority derived not from titles, but from the system itself. Others relied on his judgment to maintain balance and resolve conflicts. This understated leadership style allowed Salvatore to operate largely behind the scenes. He avoided public displays of power, preferring anonymity. This discretion protected him from both rivals and law enforcement, allowing the syndicate to grow quietly. Law enforcement agencies, meanwhile, struggled to understand the changes unfolding before them. Traditional policing methods targeted visible leaders and violent hotspots. Salvatore's system, designed to minimize both, was harder to penetrate. Arrests of low-level operatives did little to disrupt operations, and the absence of overt conflict reduced public pressure for action. The success of this approach further validated Salvatore's philosophy. Crime, when organized intelligently, could outpace the institutions designed to stop it. This realization was both empowering and dangerous. It encouraged expansion, but also bred overconfidence in some quarters. Salvatore remained vigilant against this. He constantly reassessed risks, adjusting strategies as conditions changed. He understood that no system was invulnerable. Adaptation, he believed, was an ongoing process, not a one-time achievement. As Prohibition wore on, the syndicate diversified its activities. Gambling operations expanded, prostitution networks were regulated, and labor racketeering emerged as a lucrative avenue. Each new venture was integrated into the existing framework, governed by the same principles of organization and restraint. This period marked the peak of Salvatore's influence. He had achieved what few thought possible, a criminal organization that functioned with the efficiency of a corporation. Yet this success also set the stage for inevitable confrontation. The old guard felt threatened, law enforcement grew more determined, and internal pressures mounted as the stakes rose. In the quiet moments between decisions, Salvatore reflected on the path he had chosen. He knew that building something so structured and far-reaching would attract attention eventually. But he also believed that disorder posed a greater risk. If the underworld was to survive, it needed rules. What Salvatore had built was more than an empire of crime. It was a blueprint, a model that would outlive him, shaping organized crime in America for decades to come. And as the system continued to expand, so did the tension between the old ways and the new order, a tension that could only be resolved through decisive change. As Salvatore Lucania's influence expanded quietly beneath the surface of New York's underworld, one obstacle remained firmly in his path, immovable and increasingly dangerous. Joe Masuria was not just another boss. He was the embodiment of the old order, a man who believed deeply in personal authority, public dominance, and rule by intimidation. To Masuria, power was something to be displayed openly, reinforced through fear and constant reminders of who sat at the top. To Salvatore, this way of thinking was not only outdated, it was reckless. Joe Masuria ruled through excess. He surrounded himself with bodyguards, demanded tribute, and expected unquestioned loyalty. His meals were public, his meetings crowded, his presence unmistakable. He enjoyed being seen as the boss, a title he wore proudly and guarded fiercely. For years, this approach had served him well. But as the city changed, and as crime became more profitable and complex, Masuria's style began to create strain rather than stability. Salvatore observed him carefully. He noted how Masuria's ego influenced his decisions, how personal slights often led to violent responses. Territory disputes escalated quickly under his leadership, drawing attention from rivals and law enforcement alike. While Salvatore focused on coordination and efficiency, Masuria remained locked in a mindset shaped by older conflicts and traditions. The tension between the two men was not immediately visible. Outwardly, Salvatore showed respect. He attended meetings, paid dues, and followed instructions when required. He understood that open defiance would be fatal. But beneath this surface compliance, a deeper conflict was unfolding, one rooted not in personal hatred, but in incompatible visions of the future. Masuria viewed Salvatore as useful but potentially dangerous. He recognized Salvatore's intelligence and organizational ability, yet distrusted his alliances with non-Italians and his resistance to traditional hierarchy. Rumors circulated that Salvatore was thinking too independently, that he questioned authority. In Masuria's world, questioning authority was the first step toward betrayal. As prohibition profits soared, Masuria demanded larger shares, asserting his dominance through financial pressure. He expected absolute obedience, even when his demands threatened the stability of operations. Salvatore complied outwardly, but internally, he saw the growing risk. The system he was building required balance. Masuria's interference introduced volatility. Meetings between the two were heavy with unspoken tension. Masuria spoke loudly, issuing commands and recounting past victories. Salvatore listened, offering minimal responses, careful not to reveal disagreement. He understood that words, once spoken, could not be taken back. Silence, on the other hand, allowed room to maneuver. Behind the scenes, loyalties were shifting. Younger members of Masuria's organization grew frustrated with constant wars and unpredictable leadership. They saw in Salvatore a calmer alternative, someone who valued their lives as well as their earnings. These men did not openly rebel, but their commitment wavered. When choices had to be made, they began to hedge, delaying actions, seeking advice quietly. Salvatore did not encourage this discontent directly. He allowed it to develop naturally. He believed that forced loyalty was fragile, but voluntary alignment was enduring. His role was not to incite rebellion, but to be ready when the balance tipped. Masuria, sensing the change, became more paranoid. He tightened control, increased surveillance within his own ranks, and demanded constant reassurances. This behavior only deepened resentment. Fear replaced respect, and fear, Salvatore knew, eroded loyalty over time. The situation grew more dangerous as rival factions began to exploit the instability. Whispers spread of potential betrayals, secret meetings, and shifting alliances. Each rumor heightened Masuria's suspicion and increased his reliance on brute force. The old boss, surrounded by men but increasingly isolated, was trapped by his own methods. Salvatore found himself in an increasingly precarious position. Remaining passive risked being crushed by Masuria's tightening grip. Acting too soon risked provoking a war that could destroy everything he had built. Timing, he understood, would be everything. Privately, Salvatore consulted with his closest allies. Conversations were careful, often indirect. They spoke of weather changing and roads becoming unsafe, using coded language to avoid explicit commitments. Meyer Lansky, ever analytical, emphasized patience. The system they envisioned required stability, not chaos. Any action had to be precise, final, and justified. Salvatore also considered the human cost. Violence, once unleashed, could not be easily contained. Innocent lives, loyal associates, and years of careful planning could be lost in a single miscalculation. This weighed heavily on him. He did not romanticize conflict. To him, it was a last resort, justified only when all other options were exhausted. As months passed, it became clear that coexistence was no longer sustainable. Masuria's leadership was dragging the underworld toward constant conflict, threatening profits and attracting attention. The old boss was not adapting, and worse, he was actively undermining those who tried. Salvatore understood that this was not merely a personal struggle between two men. It was a turning point for organized crime itself. One vision favored centralized power, tradition, and intimidation. The other favored cooperation, structure, and discretion. Both could not prevail. The weight of this realization settled quietly. There were no dramatic declarations, no emotional outbursts. Just a growing certainty that the path forward required decisive change. Salvatore did not see himself as a traitor to the old ways, but as a necessary force of evolution. In the evenings, as the city lights flickered on and streets filled with the hum of nightlife, Salvatore reflected on how power truly worked. It was not about who shouted the loudest or demanded the most. It was about who could maintain balance, who could see beyond the present moment. Masuria was trapped by the past. Salvatore was already living in the future. What lay ahead would be irreversible. Once the old order was challenged, there would be no return to uneasy compromise. The underworld would either continue to fracture under outdated leadership or be reshaped entirely. As the tension reached its breaking point, Salvatore remained outwardly calm, his movements measured, his words restrained. But beneath that calm was readiness. The confrontation with Joe Masuria was no longer a question of if, but when. And when it came, it would not be loud or chaotic. It would be precise, deliberate, and final, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. The decision, once made, settled over Salvatore Lucania with a strange calm. There was no celebration in it, no surge of triumph. Only acceptance. He understood that some moments in life did not announce themselves with noise or drama. They arrived quietly, demanding action without emotion. The path forward was now clear, even if the consequences were irreversible. Joe Masuria had become too dangerous to leave in place. Not because he was weak, but because he was predictable in the worst possible way. His reliance on fear, his constant displays of authority, and his refusal to adapt had turned him into a liability for everyone connected to him. The underworld was changing faster than he could comprehend, and his attempts to tighten control only accelerated the unraveling. Salvatore knew that a prolonged war would destroy everything he had worked to build. Bloodshed would invite law enforcement, fracture alliances, and destabilize the delicate balance he had carefully engineered. If Mafia were to be removed, it had to be done swiftly, decisively, and with minimal disruption. There could be no doubt about the outcome, no opportunity for retaliation. The plan itself was simple, almost unsettling in its simplicity. There would be no ambush in the street, no dramatic shootout. Salvatore understood that Mafia felt safest among his own men, surrounded by routine and familiarity. That sense of security would be the opening. In the days leading up to the event, Salvatore maintained his usual composure. He attended meetings, exchanged pleasantries, and continued business as if nothing had changed. This outward normalcy was essential. Any hint of tension could raise suspicion. He was careful with his words, his movements, even his expressions. Discipline, at this stage, was everything. Mafia, for his part, remained unaware of how isolated he had become. He trusted the structure he had built, believing fear alone guaranteed loyalty. He did not notice how conversations quieted when he entered a room, how eyes shifted away rather than meeting his gaze. He mistook obedience for devotion, a mistake that would cost him everything. The chosen setting was deliberately mundane. A restaurant, familiar and unremarkable, a place Mafia frequented without concern. Meals were rituals of comfort for him, moments where power felt unquestioned. This routine lulled him into complacency, reinforcing the illusion that he remained untouchable. When the day arrived, there was no hesitation. Salvatore accompanied Mafia as planned, maintaining the appearance of loyalty to the end. There was no visible tension between them, no final confrontation. Words were exchanged casually, the kind spoken countless times before. To anyone watching, it was just another meeting between powerful men. At the appointed moment, Salvatore excused himself, stepping away under a harmless pretext. This small detail mattered. He did not want to be present when the act occurred. Not out of fear, but out of principle. The system he envisioned did not revolve around personal violence. This was a necessary act, but not one he wished to witness. The men who remained acted quickly. There was no prolonged struggle, no chaos. The act was efficient, almost clinical. Joe Mafia, who had ruled through fear and excess, was gone in moments. The old order fell not with a roar, but with a whisper. News traveled fast, though details remained scarce. In the underworld, certainty mattered more than explanation. The message was clear, the era of unchecked personal authority was over. There would be no retaliation, no drawn-out conflict. The transition had been decisive. Salvatore did not issue statements or claim responsibility. He allowed others to draw their own conclusions. This restraint reinforced the seriousness of the change. It was not about vengeance or ambition. It was about necessity. Reactions varied. Some were relieved, having grown weary of Mafia's volatile leadership. Others were stunned, struggling to comprehend how such a powerful figure could be removed so quietly. Fear rippled through the old guard, while cautious optimism spread among those who had embraced new ideas. Salvatore moved quickly to stabilize the situation. Meetings were held to reassure allies and prevent panic. He emphasized continuity rather than change, framing the event as an unfortunate but unavoidable correction. Business would continue. Agreements would be honored. Stability was the priority. This approach minimized disruption. There were no widespread purges, no violent reprisals. Salvatore understood that excessive force would undermine the legitimacy of the new order. By acting with restraint, he reinforced his reputation as a leader who valued balance over dominance. Privately, the weight of what had happened settled in. Salvatore was not naive. He knew that crossing this threshold changed everything. There was no return to anonymity, no stepping back into the background. His role in reshaping the underworld was now undeniable. Yet there was no sense of victory. The removal of Masuria did not bring satisfaction, only responsibility. The system Salvatore envisioned now had to function without excuse. Failure would prove the old bosses right, validating their belief that tradition alone sustained order. All eyes turned quietly towards Salvatore, not because he demanded attention, but because he represented clarity in a moment of uncertainty. He did not claim titles or make grand declarations. Instead, he focused on reinforcing the principles he believed in: cooperation, negotiation, and shared interest. The assassination marked more than the end of one man's reign. It symbolized the collapse of an outdated philosophy. Fear-driven leadership, rigid hierarchy, and emotional decision-making had reached their limits. In their place emerged a new framework, one designed to reduce conflict rather than inflame it. Law enforcement, though aware of Masuria's death, struggled to interpret its meaning. Without public violence or obvious upheaval, the event appeared isolated. This ambiguity worked in Salvatore's favor. The lack of chaos suggested continuity rather than revolution. As days turned into weeks, the underworld adjusted. Operations resumed their steady rhythm. Profits continued to flow. Disputes were resolved quietly. The absence of Masuria's volatile presence brought an unexpected calm. Salvatore observed these developments with cautious satisfaction. The success of the transition validated his belief that decisive action, when carefully planned, could prevent greater harm. Violence, used sparingly and strategically, could restore balance rather than destroy it. Still, he remained vigilant. Removing one obstacle did not eliminate all resistance. Other figures, shaped by similar traditions, still held power. The system he envisioned was not yet complete. Masuria had been a major barrier, but not the last. In the quiet hours, Salvatore reflected on how easily power could dissolve when built on fear alone. Masuria had believed himself invincible, protected by loyalty and intimidation. In the end, it was neither that failed him, but his inability to adapt. The underworld had crossed a threshold. The assassination was not just an ending, but a beginning. A signal that the future would belong to those who understood structure over spectacle, cooperation over chaos. Salvatore Lucania had taken a step that could not be undone. The old world was fading, and a new one was emerging in its place. The next challenge would be even greater, not just removing outdated leadership, but building a system strong enough to endure. With Joe Masuria gone, a quiet vacuum settled over the underworld. It was not empty for long. Into that space stepped Salvatore Maranzano, a man who believed deeply that history itself had chosen him. Where Masuria ruled through excess and intimidation, Maranzano ruled through symbolism and structure rooted firmly in the past. He styled himself as a modern Caesar, studying ancient Roman texts, speaking in grand terms about order, hierarchy, and destiny. To many traditionalists, he appeared to be the answer to chaos, a return to discipline after years of disorder. At first, Maranzano's rise seemed almost orderly. He reorganized factions, promoted loyalists, and spoke passionately about restoring honor and tradition to the Mafia. He believed the turmoil of recent years proved the danger of unchecked ambition and ethnic cooperation. In his mind, the solution was not modernization, but stricter adherence to Sicilian values. Bloodlines mattered. Obedience mattered. And above all, there would be one supreme authority. Maranzano declared himself the boss of bosses, a title heavy with symbolism and danger. It concentrated power in a way that appealed to his sense of grandeur but alarmed men like Salvatore Lucania. To Salvatore, this was not progress, it was regression. Centralized authority invited resentment, rebellion, and ultimately, instability. The lessons of Masuria's downfall were already being ignored. Outwardly, Salvatore appeared cooperative. He accepted Maranzano's reorganization, took his assigned position, and showed respect. Inwardly, he analyzed every move. He watched how Maranzano conducted meetings, how he spoke to subordinates, how he rewarded loyalty and punished dissent. The patterns were familiar, and troubling. Fear once again replaced trust. Titles mattered more than competence. Decisions flowed downward without discussion. Maranzano surrounded himself with old-world loyalists, men who valued tradition over innovation. He spoke openly of eliminating rivals and consolidating power permanently. His vision was rigid, inflexible, and dangerously confident. To him, the future was a return to the past, enforced with discipline and ceremony. Salvatore understood the implications immediately. A boss of bosses could not tolerate independent thinkers. Cooperation across ethnic lines would be curtailed. The syndicate Salvatore and his allies envisioned, a decentralized network built on negotiation, had no place in Maranzano's world. Worse still, Maranzano had begun quietly compiling lists of those he viewed as threats. Information reached Salvatore through whispers and trusted intermediaries. Names were being discussed. Meetings were held without him. Questions were asked about his alliances, his ambitions, his loyalty. Maranzano, despite his reverence for tradition, was no fool. He recognized Salvatore's intelligence and influence, and that recognition bred suspicion. The atmosphere grew tense. Men spoke more carefully. Loyalties felt uncertain. The calm that followed Masuria's removal began to fracture under Maranzano's authoritarian approach. Once again, the underworld stood at a crossroads. Salvatore did not rush to judgment. He weighed every option. Could Maranzano be reasoned with? Could compromise preserve stability? The answer became clearer with each passing week. Maranzano's worldview left no room for partnership. He believed authority must flow from the top, unquestioned. Anyone capable of independent power was, by definition, a threat. The realization was sobering. Removing Masuria had been difficult, but necessary. Removing Maranzano would be even more consequential. Doing so too openly could plunge the underworld into chaos. Doing nothing would mean eventual elimination. Once again, Salvatore turned to his closest allies. Conversations were quiet, careful, and deliberate. There was no excitement in these discussions, only resolve. They spoke not of ambition, but of survival. The pattern was repeating itself, and Salvatore knew how it ended if left unchecked. The plan that emerged was even more precise than before. It relied on speed, deception, and finality. Maranzano believed himself protected by ritual and hierarchy. That belief would be used against him. Timing was critical. Salvatore waited until Maranzano felt secure, until he believed his authority unquestioned and his enemies subdued. The more confident Maranzano became, the less he guarded against subtle threats. He trusted tradition to shield him, unaware that tradition could not protect against modern tactics. On the chosen day, Maranzano prepared for what he believed was routine business. His office was a place of authority, lined with symbols of power and history. He saw himself not as a gangster, but as a ruler restoring order to a fractured world. That self-image blinded him. The men who entered his office appeared unremarkable. They were dressed as officials, carrying themselves with quiet professionalism. There was no immediate sense of danger. Maranzano, accustomed to obedience, did not question their presence. What followed was swift and irreversible. There was no prolonged struggle, no chance for speeches or defenses. The man who declared himself supreme authority fell without ceremony. The title of "Boss of Bosses" died with him. The shock rippled through the underworld, deeper and more profound than after Masuria's death. Two pillars of the old system were gone in rapid succession. The message was unmistakable: centralized, fear-based authority would no longer be tolerated. Salvatore did not step forward to claim Maranzano's title. In fact, he did the opposite. He rejected the very idea of a single supreme boss. Instead, He moved quickly to dismantle the structure that had allowed such power to accumulate. Meetings were held with leaders from various factions. The tone was calm, pragmatic, and forward-looking. Salvatore spoke not of conquest or dominance, but of prevention. No more internal wars. No more titles that invited envy and rebellion. The future, he argued, required shared governance. Out of these discussions emerged a radical concept, a commission made up of leaders from major families, designed to resolve disputes collectively. No single man would rule over all. Power would be balanced, decisions negotiated. It was a direct rejection of Maranzano's vision and a culmination of Salvatore's philosophy. The response was cautious but receptive. The recent upheavals had left many wary of absolute authority. The promise of stability, of rules that applied to everyone, was appealing. Slowly, agreement formed. In the weeks that followed, the underworld began to reorganize once more, this time on entirely new principles. Violence subsided. Profit stabilized. The constant threat of internal war diminished. Salvatore watched these changes with measured satisfaction. The fall of Maranzano was not a victory in the traditional sense. It was a correction, a necessary step in a larger process. The old world, defined by ritual and ego, was finally giving way to something more durable. Yet Salvatore remained realistic. Every system carried risks. Balance required maintenance. Cooperation demanded trust. But for the first time, the underworld had a framework designed to survive its own ambitions. The age of kings had ended. In its place rose an era of architects, planners, and negotiators. And at the center of that quiet transformation stood Salvatore Lucania, not as a ruler, but as the man who ensured that no one else ever ruled alone again. In the aftermath of rapid upheaval, the underworld found itself strangely still. Two powerful figures had vanished in quick succession, and yet the chaos many had feared did not arrive. There were no open wars, no waves of retaliation, no collapse of operations. Instead, there was a cautious quiet, as if everyone was waiting to see what shape the future would take. It was within this pause that Salvatore Lucania moved most decisively, not with violence, but with ideas. He understood something fundamental: removing men was easy compared to removing the conditions that created them. If power continued to pool in one place, another Masuria or Maranzano would eventually rise. The problem was not individuals, but structure. And structure, Salvatore believed, could be redesigned. The solution he proposed was radical in its restraint. Rather than appointing a new supreme leader, he suggested eliminating the position altogether. In its place would stand a governing body, a council composed of the most influential leaders from major families. This group would not command through fear or title, but through consensus. Decisions would be discussed, disputes arbitrated, and violence used only as a last resort. At first, the idea met resistance. Many were conditioned to think in terms of hierarchy. A single boss, however dangerous, was familiar. A shared authority felt uncertain, even weak. Salvatore anticipated these concerns and addressed them calmly. He did not argue from morality, but from pragmatism. A balanced system, he explained, protected everyone's interests. No one family could dominate the others. No single man could drag the entire underworld into war. Meetings were arranged discreetly. Leaders arrived cautiously, each wary of the other's intentions. Old rivalries lingered, and trust was fragile. Salvatore set the tone by speaking little and listening carefully. He allowed grievances to surface, knowing that acknowledgement was the first step toward resolution. When he did speak, his words were measured and practical. He outlined how the commission would function. Territories would be respected. Profits would be protected. Disputes would be resolved through discussion rather than gunfire. If violence became unavoidable, it would require collective agreement, ensuring it was used strategically rather than impulsively. This process, he argued, reduced risk for everyone involved. The logic was difficult to refute. Recent events had demonstrated the dangers of unchecked authority. Many leaders had lost friends, money, and security due to internal wars. The promise of stability, of predictable outcomes, was deeply appealing. Gradually, resistance softened. Questions replaced objections. How would representation be determined? How would enforcement work? Salvatore addressed each concern patiently. Representation would reflect influence and territory, ensuring no single group dominated. Enforcement would rely on mutual interest. Those who broke the rules would find themselves isolated, cut off from protection and profit. This concept of collective responsibility marked a profound shift. Loyalty would no longer be tied solely to individuals, but to the system itself. Breaking the rules would not provoke immediate violence, but long-term exclusion. In an environment driven by profit, exclusion was a powerful deterrent. As discussions continued, a framework took shape. The major New York families would each have a voice, along with representation from key regional allies. The commission would meet periodically, its existence known only to those who needed to know. Decisions would be binding, not because of fear, but because cooperation served everyone's interests. Salvatore was careful not to position himself as chairman or leader. He declined titles and formal authority. This was intentional. By refusing overt power, he reinforced the legitimacy of the system. He wanted the commission to outlive him, to function regardless of who sat at the table. The effect was immediate. Tensions eased as leaders adjusted to the new order. Old feuds cooled under the promise of arbitration. Younger members, witnessing the decline in violence, felt a growing sense of security. Profits stabilized, and operations expanded quietly. Law enforcement, accustomed to targeting individual bosses, struggled to adapt. Without a central figure to arrest or intimidate, their efforts yielded diminishing returns. The Commission's decentralized structure made it resilient, capable of absorbing losses without collapsing. Salvatore watched these developments with cautious optimism. The system was working, but he knew it was fragile. It depended on discipline, patience, and a shared commitment to restraint. One impulsive act could test its limits. He also recognized the irony of his position. Though he held no official title, his influence was undeniable. Others looked to him for guidance, not because he demanded it, but because he embodied the principles the system was built upon. He was the quiet center of gravity, the architect whose design shaped everything around him. This influence carried its own burden. Every decision, every compromise, set a precedent. Salvatore was acutely aware that his choices would echo long after he was gone. He weighed options carefully, prioritizing long-term stability over short-term gain. As the Commission solidified, organized crime in America entered a new phase. Violence became more calculated, less frequent. Cooperation across ethnic lines increased. The underworld began to resemble a shadow economy governed by rules rather than raw force. Critics within the old guard muttered about weakness and loss of honor. Salvatore paid them little attention. He measured success not in reputation, but in results. Fewer funerals. Fewer police raids. Steadier income. These were the metrics that mattered. In private moments, Salvatore reflected on how far he had come, from a boy navigating tenement streets to a man reshaping an entire hidden world. The irony was not lost on him. He had risen by rejecting the very symbols of power that others coveted. The Commission was not perfect. Disputes still arose. Ambition still simmered. But for the first time, there was a mechanism to manage these forces without descending into chaos. It was an experiment, unprecedented and risky. Yet as months passed and stability held, confidence grew. The underworld adapted, as it always did. And in that adaptation, Salvatore saw confirmation of his belief: systems, when designed thoughtfully, could outlast individuals. The era of singular kings had ended. In its place stood a council, quiet and unseen, governing through balance rather than fear. And at the heart of that transformation was a man who understood that true power did not need a crown, it needed rules that everyone agreed to follow. With the new order firmly in place, a strange paradox defined Salvatore Lucania's life. He was more powerful than ever, yet less visible than at any point before. There were no grand titles attached to his name, no public declarations of authority, no throne from which he ruled. And yet, beneath the surface, the system he had designed moved according to principles he had set in motion. Power no longer required a crown, and Salvatore preferred it that way. His days settled into a rhythm defined by calculation and restraint. Meetings were fewer and smaller, often held in unremarkable locations chosen for their anonymity. Conversations were short, focused, and deliberate. He delegated extensively, trusting lieutenants to handle details while he concentrated on maintaining balance across the wider network. This distance protected him, but it also isolated him. Salvatore understood that visibility invited danger. The more attention a man attracted, the more vulnerable he became, to rivals, to law enforcement, to his own ambition. He had seen what happened to those who sought to be seen as kings. They became targets. By contrast, a man who operated quietly, who allowed others to believe they acted independently, could shape outcomes without drawing fire. Despite this discretion, his influence was widely recognized within the underworld. When disputes threatened to escalate, his opinion was sought. When new opportunities arose, his approval was quietly requested. He did not command obedience, he offered guidance. Those who followed his advice prospered. Those who ignored it often found themselves entangled in problems that could have been avoided. The commission, now functioning smoothly, served as both shield and instrument. It absorbed tensions that once erupted into violence, allowing disagreements to be resolved through discussion. Salvatore rarely dominated these meetings. Instead, he facilitated, steering conversations toward compromise without imposing solutions. This approach reinforced the legitimacy of the system and prevented resentment from building. Financially, Salvatore was secure beyond anything he had imagined in his youth. Profits flowed steadily from diversified ventures, gambling, labor racketeering, remaining Prohibition-era enterprises, and other illicit activities. Yet he resisted ostentatious displays of wealth. His lifestyle was comfortable but understated. Expensive suits and fine meals were balanced by caution. Wealth, he believed, was safest when it did not announce itself. This restraint extended to his personal life. Salvatore maintained relationships, but rarely allowed emotional attachments to interfere with business. He understood that personal entanglements created vulnerabilities. Friends could become liabilities. Family could be used as leverage. This emotional distance, while protective, also deepened his sense of solitude. The city around him continued to change. Prohibition edged toward its end, altering the landscape of organized crime. Some operations shrank, others adapted. Salvatore watched these shifts carefully, encouraging diversification and foresight. He had always believed that adaptability was essential to survival. The end of one opportunity merely signaled the beginning of another. Law enforcement pressure remained constant, though less focused than before. Without a singular boss to pursue, authorities struggled to make meaningful progress. Investigations dragged on, hindered by lack of clear targets and solid evidence. Salvatore took no comfort in this. He knew that institutions learned and evolved, just as criminals did. Complacency was dangerous. To mitigate risk, he emphasized insulation. Layers separated decision-makers from operatives. Communication was carefully managed. Records were avoided. These precautions slowed operations slightly but increased longevity. Salvatore favored survival over speed. As his influence peaked, so did the psychological weight of his position. Every decision carried consequences beyond his immediate circle. A misjudgment could destabilize alliances, provoke conflict, or invite scrutiny. Salvatore bore this responsibility quietly, rarely sharing doubts or fears. Leadership, he believed, required composure above all else. Occasionally, he reflected on the irony of his situation. He had set out to reduce chaos, to create order where none existed. In doing so, he had placed himself at the center of a vast, invisible web. The system depended on his continued judgment, even as it was designed to function without him. This contradiction weighed heavily. Younger figures within the underworld looked to him as a model, though few fully understood his philosophy. Some admired his restraint, others misinterpreted it as weakness. Salvatore remained unconcerned. He had learned long ago that perception mattered less than results. The Commission's success validated his belief that power could be shared without dissolving into disorder. Yet he remained vigilant. Systems required maintenance. Rules required enforcement. Complacency bred decay. Salvatore stayed engaged, monitoring developments, intervening when necessary. His greatest satisfaction came not from control, but from stability. Fewer funerals. Fewer wars. Steady income. These outcomes confirmed that his approach worked. In a world built on violence, restraint was a radical act. Still, beneath the calm surface, tension persisted. Ambition did not disappear, it merely adapted. New figures rose, each with their own ideas and desires. Salvatore knew that the system would eventually be tested again. He could not prevent change, only guide it. In quiet moments, often late at night, he considered the cost of his choices. The distance from ordinary life. The constant vigilance. The knowledge that trust was always conditional. These were the prices of power, even when power was exercised quietly. As prohibition officially ended, the underworld shifted once more. Some lost fortunes, others found new paths. Salvatore encouraged pragmatism, reminding allies that nostalgia was useless. The world moved forward whether they wished it to or not. At the height of his influence, Salvatore Lucania stood as a paradox, a man who reshaped organized crime without ruling it openly, who wielded authority by refusing to claim it. His empire had no flag, no anthem, no public face. It existed in agreements honored, disputes avoided, and profits quietly shared. This was power without spectacle, leadership without ceremony. And while it offered protection and control, it also demanded constant restraint. Salvatore accepted this trade-off without complaint. He had built something enduring, something designed to survive not just his enemies, but his own ambition. Yet even as the system functioned smoothly, forces beyond his control were gathering. Law enforcement, politics, and public sentiment were shifting. The calm he had achieved was real, but not permanent. And though he could not yet see its shape, the next challenge was already approaching, drawn inevitably toward the man who had made himself indispensable by never asking to be noticed. The pressure did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, almost politely, as pressure often does when it comes from institutions rather than rivals. For years, Salvatore Lucania had focused his attention on balancing criminal interests, managing personalities, and maintaining stability within the underworld. What he could not control, no matter how carefully he planned, was the growing determination of the state itself. And at the center of that determination stood a young, ambitious prosecutor who believed that dismantling organized crime was not only possible, but necessary. Thomas E. Dewey entered the story not as a dramatic antagonist, but as a disciplined strategist. He was methodical, patient, and deeply aware of public perception. Unlike earlier lawmen who relied on raids and intimidation, Dewey understood that long-term success required airtight cases, credible witnesses, and narratives the public could understand. He did not chase myths. He chased systems. Dewey's early investigations focused on vice crimes, prostitution, gambling, and labor racketeering, areas where evidence could be accumulated slowly. He recognized that proving murder or conspiracy at the highest levels was difficult, but proving financial control and exploitation was more achievable. This approach made him especially dangerous to someone like Salvatore, whose power rested not on direct violence, but on coordination. At first, Salvatore observed Dewey from a distance. He had seen prosecutors rise and fall before, their careers often built on ambition rather than results. Many burned out or were redirected to safer assignments. Dewey, however, was different. He did not seek quick victories. He built cases piece by piece, assembling a mosaic of testimony and documentation. The first signs of trouble appeared in subtle ways. Associates were questioned more aggressively. Raids became more targeted. Courtroom strategies shifted. Informants were treated with care rather than intimidation. Salvatore recognized the pattern immediately. This was not random enforcement. This was focused pressure. The commission discussed the situation cautiously. Some dismissed Dewey as another name that would fade. Others urged restraint, warning that overreaction could confirm suspicions. Salvatore listened, weighing each perspective. He understood that the greatest risk was not Dewey himself, but the system Dewey represented. Institutions had memory. Even if one man failed, the knowledge remained. Salvatore adjusted his operations accordingly. Communication tightened. Meetings became rarer. Financial trails were minimized. He encouraged caution, reminding allies that survival depended on patience. At the same time, he understood that insulation could only go so far. The more complex a system became, the more points of vulnerability it contained. Dewey exploited those vulnerabilities intelligently. He focused on individuals with limited loyalty and significant exposure. Low-level operatives, madams, bookkeepers, people who faced long sentences and had little to gain from silence. He offered them alternatives, reduced charges, protection, a chance at a different life. Not all accepted, but enough did. Salvatore sensed the shift before it became obvious. The tone of conversations changed. Some associates grew nervous, distracted. The quiet confidence that had once defined operations began to erode. Fear, long suppressed by stability, resurfaced in subtler forms. This worried Salvatore more than open panic. Quiet fear made people unpredictable. He resisted the urge to react forcefully. Retaliation against law enforcement was unthinkable. Intimidating witnesses only strengthened Dewey's resolve and improved his public standing. Salvatore understood that the rules had changed. Survival now depended on legal strategy as much as street discipline. As Dewey's profile rose, so did public appetite for results. Newspapers began to frame him as a crusader against vice. Headlines focused on morality, corruption, and reform. This public narrative gave Dewey political protection and momentum. Salvatore watched with concern as the cultural tide shifted against the underworld he had worked so hard to stabilize. The case against him, when it began to form, did not center on murder or conspiracy, but on compulsory prostitution. It was a strategic choice. These charges were easier to explain to juries and carried heavy sentences. More importantly, they allowed Dewey to target the system rather than individual acts of violence. Salvatore recognized the danger immediately. He had always believed that distance protected him, that delegation insulated leadership. Dewey's strategy challenged that assumption. By arguing that control did not require physical presence, Dewey sought to redefine responsibility itself. If successful, it would expose not just Salvatore, but anyone who operated through networks. The psychological toll of this realization was significant. For the first time in years, Salvatore faced an opponent he could not negotiate with, intimidate, or outmaneuver quietly. The law moved at its own pace, governed by procedures and public accountability. It did not fear retaliation in the same way individuals did. Salvatore remained composed outwardly. He continued to attend to business, offering reassurance where needed. Privately, he consulted attorneys, reviewed contingencies, and prepared for outcomes he had long considered unlikely. He understood that preparation did not signal defeat, it signaled realism. The commission discussed succession and continuity, not as a sign of weakness, but as prudence. Salvatore encouraged these discussions. The system had to function regardless of individual circumstances. This, after all, was the principle it was built upon. Dewey's investigation tightened like a noose, though it was invisible to the public. Subpoenas multiplied. Witnesses rehearsed testimony. Timelines were constructed. Salvatore became increasingly aware that the confrontation ahead would not be resolved in alleys or boardrooms, but in courtrooms under bright lights. Despite the mounting pressure, Salvatore refused to flee. Leaving would confirm guilt and destabilize the system. He believed, perhaps stubbornly, that he could face the challenge directly. This decision was not driven by arrogance, but by calculation. Running would destroy everything he had built. Staying preserved the possibility, however slim, of survival. As the moment approached, Salvatore reflected on the irony of his situation. He had reduced violence, imposed order, and created stability, yet it was this very success that made him visible to reformers. Chaos had always been easier to dismiss. Order invited scrutiny. The calm he maintained was not born of confidence, but of acceptance. Every system, no matter how well designed, encountered limits. He had reached one of his own. When the indictment finally came, it was thorough, deliberate, and public. Dewey had chosen his moment carefully. The charges were framed not just as crimes, but as symbols of corruption. Salvatore was no longer just a man in the underworld. He had become a representation of everything reformers sought to erase. Yet even in this moment, Salvatore remained true to his nature. He did not lash out. He did not plead publicly. He prepared. The confrontation between Salvatore Lucania and the law was no longer theoretical. It was inevitable. And unlike his previous battles, this one would not be decided by loyalty, strategy, or negotiation, but by the slow, relentless machinery of justice, moving forward with a patience that mirrored his own. The courtroom was brighter than any room Salvatore Lucania had ever feared. There were no shadows to hide in, no corners where silence could protect him. Everything here was exposed, faces, words, gestures, examined under the steady gaze of the public. This was not a battlefield he had chosen, yet it was one he had prepared for in his own way, long before he ever entered the building. The trial was framed as a reckoning, not just for one man, but for an entire hidden system. Prosecutors did not present Salvatore as a street criminal or a thug. They portrayed him as a mastermind, a quiet controller whose influence reached far beyond what could be seen. This framing was deliberate. It transformed abstraction into narrative, giving jurors a story they could follow and fear. Salvatore sat through the proceedings with controlled composure. He understood the theater of the courtroom, how every movement could be interpreted. He listened carefully, rarely reacting, his face calm, almost distant. To some, this appeared arrogant. To others, inscrutable. In truth, it was discipline, the same discipline that had guided him through years of unseen power. Witness after witness was called, many from worlds Salvatore had deliberately kept far from himself. Women who had worked in brothels, intermediaries who had managed finances, men who now stood nervously under oath. Their testimonies were not dramatic individually, but together they formed a pattern. The prosecution did not need to prove Salvatore's physical presence at crimes. They only needed to prove control. That was Dewey's brilliance. He argued that power did not require proximity. Orders could be implied. Structures could enforce obedience without direct commands. The system itself, he claimed, was evidence of intent. Salvatore's greatest strength, his ability to operate indirectly, was being turned against him. Defense attorneys countered carefully. They emphasized the lack of direct evidence, the unreliability of witnesses seeking reduced sentences, the danger of convicting a man based on inference. They reminded the jury that reputation was not proof, and that association was not guilt. It was a solid defense, but it struggled against the emotional weight of the narrative presented. Outside the courtroom, public opinion hardened quickly. Newspapers framed the trial as a moral crusade. Headlines simplified complex realities into symbols of vice and corruption. Salvatore became less a person and more a representation, a convenient embodiment of everything reformers despised about organized crime. Inside, time moved slowly. Days blurred into one another, marked by testimony, objections, and quiet consultations. Salvatore felt the strain, though he rarely showed it. The loss of control weighed heavily. In his world, outcomes could be influenced through negotiation and foresight. Here, everything depended on others, jurors, judges, public sentiment. As the trial progressed, it became clear that the outcome would not hinge on a single piece of evidence, but on perception. The prosecution painted Salvatore as indispensable to the system, too intelligent and too central to be innocent. The defense argued that this very intelligence made him a target, scapegoated for crimes committed by others. Salvatore listened, reflecting on the irony. He had spent years decentralizing power, ensuring that no single man was essential. Yet now he was being prosecuted precisely because he was seen as irreplaceable. The system he built had outgrown him, but the law still saw his shadow everywhere. When closing arguments arrived, the tension was palpable. Dewey spoke calmly, methodically, appealing not to anger but to responsibility. He asked the jury to consider the harm caused by systems that thrived on exploitation, even without visible violence. He framed the verdict as a choice between complicity and accountability. The defense responded by urging caution. They warned against fear-driven justice, against condemning a man based on reputation rather than proof. They reminded jurors of the precedent such a conviction would set. Power, they argued, should not be criminalized without clear evidence of direct action. The jury deliberated longer than many expected. Hours stretched into days. Salvatore waited, his mind disciplined, refusing to imagine outcomes. He had learned long ago that anticipation wasted energy. What would happen would happen. When the verdict was finally read, the room fell into a heavy silence. Guilty. The word echoed not just through the courtroom, but through the underworld itself. The sentence that followed, decades in prison, was severe, designed to send a message. This was not merely punishment, it was deterrence. Salvatore absorbed the moment quietly. There was no outburst, no visible shock. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a conclusion he had long considered. In that instant, his life divided cleanly into before and after. The reaction outside was immediate. Reformers celebrated. Law enforcement hailed the verdict as a turning point. Newspapers declared the fall of a king, even though Salvatore had never claimed the crown they imagined. The myth of his power now eclipsed the reality. Inside the underworld, the response was more complex. Some feared chaos. Others believed the system would hold. Salvatore had anticipated this moment, encouraging structures that did not depend on his presence. Still, uncertainty spread. The quiet architect was being removed from the blueprint. In the days that followed, Salvatore prepared for incarceration with the same calm he brought to every challenge. He settled affairs where possible, issued no dramatic farewells, and avoided emotional displays. He understood that his behavior now would shape perceptions long after he was gone. Prison represented a different kind of confinement. Not just physical restriction, but isolation from the flow of information and influence. Salvatore did not know how much of his reach would remain, how much would fade. He accepted that uncertainty without complaint. As he was led away, the contrast between worlds was stark. The courtroom, with its rules and rituals, faded behind him. Ahead lay walls, schedules, and silence. Yet even here, Salvatore carried something intangible with him, the knowledge that systems, once built, often outlived their creators. The trial had stripped him of freedom, but not of legacy. Whether the world acknowledged it or not, the structures he designed continued to function. Violence did not erupt. Profits did not vanish overnight. The commission endured. In the end, the trial of Salvatore Lucania was not simply about guilt or innocence. It was about control, who wielded it, and how. The law had asserted its authority, drawing a clear boundary. But beneath that boundary, the quiet order Salvatore had built remained, adapting as it always had. As the prison gates closed behind him, a chapter ended. Not with chaos or bloodshed, but with finality. The man who had reshaped the underworld now faced a world designed to strip him of influence entirely. What remained to be seen was whether power, once learned and once exercised so subtly, could truly be erased, or whether it would simply find new ways to endure in silence. Prison was a world apart, a place where the routines of the street, the subtle networks of influence, and the quiet authority that Salvatore Lucania had spent years cultivating were suddenly suspended. The streets of New York, the networks of allies, the whispering corridors of the underworld, all of it was replaced by walls, iron bars, and a rigid schedule that demanded obedience in every small detail. For a man accustomed to orchestrating vast systems with calculated precision, this new environment was both a challenge and a revelation. At first, the reality of confinement struck sharply. Salvatore had always relied on movement, discretion, and delegation. Now, each decision, each interaction, was constrained by rules imposed from above. Yet even in this environment, he began to observe, to analyze, and to adapt. Prison, in many ways, was another system, albeit one designed to restrict rather than enable. The principles he had learned on the streets and in the boardrooms of crime were surprisingly relevant here: observation, patience, and careful calculation. He studied the routines of guards, the shifting hierarchies among inmates, the ways in which favors could be traded or withheld. Power existed, even here, but it was subtle. Influence was exercised not through force of arms but through information, reputation, and the ability to anticipate others' moves. Salvatore approached it as he always had, quietly, methodically, and with restraint. Even behind bars, Salvatore's mind remained active. He considered the future of the organization he had built, aware that while he was physically removed, the system itself was still functioning. The commission, his decentralized structure, continued to operate without him. Orders were executed, disputes mediated, profits collected. The empire he had created was, in a sense, self-sustaining, a reflection of the careful planning and foresight he had applied throughout his career. Yet distance brought clarity. Salvatore could observe the underworld from a perspective he had never had before, one free from the immediate pressures of daily operations. He could see how loyalty and obedience functioned, how individuals reacted to new challenges, and how rumors spread. He noticed patterns of behavior that would have been invisible amidst the constant bustle of power struggles on the street. This period of reflection was not without frustration. Salvatore had grown accustomed to control, to being the quiet center around which events moved. Prison forced a new kind of patience, one that tested both his discipline and his psychological endurance. There were moments of loneliness, when the weight of isolation pressed in and the absence of familiar networks felt profound. Yet he learned to temper this discomfort with meditation on larger systems, on the enduring structures he had put into place. Relationships within the prison walls followed familiar logic, though in a compressed form. Alliances formed based on utility rather than tradition, reputation mattered more than strength, and observation determined who could be trusted. Salvatore navigated this microcosm as he had the larger underworld, with discretion, patience, and attention to subtle cues. Those who sought to test him quickly realized that he was not impulsive, that he measured every interaction, and that crossing him was unwise. News from the outside world filtered in sporadically. Salvatore learned of ongoing disputes, emerging threats, and changes in alliances. Each report was analyzed carefully. He provided guidance where possible, often through intermediaries, ensuring that the organization remained stable even in his absence. The structures he had designed proved resilient. They required less intervention than expected, validating his philosophy that systems, not individuals, were the true foundation of enduring influence. Despite the physical constraints, Salvatore did not retreat mentally. He continued to plan, to strategize, and to anticipate. He considered the eventual end of prohibition, the potential legal and economic changes, and the ways in which the syndicate could adapt. This intellectual engagement provided both purpose and comfort, a reminder that power could exist in forms beyond physical presence. Prison also allowed him to reflect on the personal cost of his choices. He thought about the solitude, the constant vigilance, and the sacrifices that had enabled him to build his empire. Relationships outside the underworld were limited, shaped by secrecy and necessity. Friends were often distant, family connections tenuous. Yet these reflections reinforced his understanding of trade-offs. Power, longevity, and influence came at the price of ordinary life. Interactions with fellow inmates were revealing. Many were impulsive, reactive, or unable to see the broader consequences of their actions. Salvatore recognized the same patterns he had observed in young street operatives decades earlier. He approached them with measured engagement, offering guidance only when necessary and avoiding unnecessary attention. His reputation preceded him quietly, even those unfamiliar with his history sensed a level of calculation and control that commanded respect. In moments of solitude, Salvatore considered the philosophy that had guided his rise. Authority was most effective when subtle, when exercised without spectacle. Systems were stronger than individuals. Restraint was a form of power. These principles were now being tested under conditions more extreme than any street conflict or negotiation. The lessons were reinforced, adaptability, patience, and foresight were paramount. As years passed, Salvatore maintained an inner equilibrium. He accepted the limitations of his environment while exploiting every opportunity to observe, influence, and reflect. The physical walls could contain him, but they could not limit his understanding, his planning, or his intellectual reach. He remained a quiet architect, even in confinement. Prison also offered perspective on the broader trajectory of organized crime. He observed how his absence affected operations, disputes flared and resolved themselves, alliances shifted, and profits ebbed and flowed. The system adapted, demonstrating resilience beyond his immediate oversight. This reinforced his belief in the power of decentralized authority and the importance of designing organizations that did not depend on any single individual. Even in isolation, Salvatore remained aware of potential threats. Rivals might seek to capitalize on his imprisonment. Law enforcement could apply additional pressure. Political climates could shift. He prepared for each eventuality mentally, developing contingencies and instructing allies where possible. Every action, every observation, was filtered through the lens of strategic foresight. Over time, the monotony of daily life in prison became a backdrop against which Salvatore honed his understanding of human behavior and organizational dynamics. He had moved from the bustling chaos of New York streets to a controlled environment, yet the same principles applied: observation, patience, adaptation, and strategic decision-making. Prison was not merely punishment, it was an extended period of reflection, consolidation, and preparation. Salvatore Lucania had spent decades building an empire invisible to outsiders. Now, confined physically, he continued to manage, to analyze, and to ensure its continuity. Walls and schedules could not erase the influence of a mind trained to see systems, anticipate behavior, and design enduring structures. In this quiet, constrained environment, he remained as powerful as ever, though in ways few would ever recognize. By the early 1940s, the world had changed in ways even Salvatore Lucania could not have fully anticipated. The United States, previously isolated from global conflict, now faced a war that reached into every port, every factory, and every dock. The stakes were no longer confined to profits or power within the underworld, national security itself had become the arena. For a man accustomed to orchestrating operations quietly, with precision and patience, this new reality demanded adaptation beyond anything he had previously faced. While serving his prison sentence, Salvatore was approached by government officials with a proposition that seemed improbable on the surface. The U.S. was concerned about the efficiency and security of its maritime supply lines, particularly along the Atlantic coast. Intelligence indicated that enemy agents could exploit vulnerabilities at docks and shipping ports. Organized crime, with its entrenched networks, knowledge of labor unions, and influence over shipping operations, represented both a risk and an opportunity. Salvatore, as the architect of much of that system, was uniquely positioned to assist. The arrangement was delicate and unconventional. Salvatore's cooperation would not absolve him entirely of his legal circumstances, but it offered a path to negotiation, influence, and potentially an early release. For him, it was an opportunity to apply the same strategic thinking that had guided his underworld empire to a national problem. While some might have balked at aligning with authorities they had long evaded or opposed, Salvatore recognized the pragmatism of the choice: survival, continued relevance, and leverage over a system that still operated according to his rules. Implementation of the plan required careful coordination. Salvatore advised on personnel placement, providing guidance on which figures within the dock unions and shipping industries could be relied upon and which posed risks. He mapped networks of influence, detailing where intervention could prevent sabotage and ensure smooth operations. His understanding of human behavior, loyalty, and incentives translated seamlessly from illicit enterprise to strategic national concern. At the same time, he remained cautious. The government was an unfamiliar partner, and the stakes were unprecedented. Missteps could lead not only to failure in the mission but to permanent isolation, betrayal, or renewed prosecution. Salvatore approached every meeting, every recommendation, with the same discipline he had applied to decades of criminal coordination: meticulous, measured, and pragmatic. The results were remarkable. Ports became more secure, shipments moved more reliably, and incidents of sabotage decreased. Salvatore's interventions, though invisible to the public, proved critical in maintaining wartime logistics. What had once been channels for profit and influence now served strategic imperatives for the nation itself. This alignment of organized crime infrastructure with national security interests represented a unique convergence of necessity, opportunity, and strategic genius. The implications extended beyond the immediate mission. Salvatore's cooperation demonstrated that the underworld, often viewed solely as a source of chaos, could operate as a disciplined network capable of serving broader objectives when properly guided. It also enhanced his leverage. Government authorities recognized his indispensability, a reality that subtly shifted negotiations regarding his incarceration and future. Salvatore understood the political nuance involved. Cooperation with the government was not a guarantee of safety. Public opinion, bureaucratic rivalries, and shifting administrations could alter agreements overnight. He carefully calibrated his engagement, providing maximum benefit while maintaining autonomy and protecting long-term interests. Trust, he realized, remained as valuable as influence. Even allies in power required careful handling. This collaboration also reinforced lessons Salvatore had long understood about human motivation and systemic behavior. Incentives shaped loyalty. Clear communication prevented errors. Authority, when exercised strategically, could achieve outcomes far beyond brute force. These principles, developed over decades in the shadows, were now being tested and validated on a national stage. Within the underworld, awareness of Salvatore's cooperation spread quietly. Some allies viewed it with skepticism, wary of government entanglement. Others recognized the strategic advantage. Salvatore's continued relevance meant that the networks he designed remained robust, reducing the risk of fragmentation during his absence. The syndicate adapted, maintaining operations while also contributing, indirectly, to the war effort. Salvatore himself maintained distance from public recognition. He did not seek accolades or visibility. The operation required discretion, and his philosophy had always emphasized results over recognition. Yet the knowledge of his impact, and the tangible effects of his guidance, reinforced his confidence in systems and strategy over force or fear. The experience also illuminated the broader intersection of legality and utility. Salvatore had spent a lifetime navigating spaces outside the law, yet here, he operated in alignment with formal authority for mutual benefit. The duality was striking. Influence, when exercised strategically, could transcend conventional boundaries, shaping outcomes in multiple spheres simultaneously. This realization affirmed his long-held belief that structures, rather than individuals, were the true source of enduring power. Through careful observation and strategic input, Salvatore ensured that the docks remained secure, labor disputes were minimized, and operations flowed without disruption. His understanding of human incentives allowed him to anticipate potential conflicts and mitigate them before they escalated. Each decision, though subtle, reinforced both national security and the stability of the underworld networks he had helped build. By the end of this period, Salvatore had achieved a rare form of leverage. He had demonstrated the ability to apply decades of underworld expertise to challenges of national significance. He had reinforced the resilience of his organization, maintained his relevance despite incarceration, and subtly positioned himself for negotiation regarding his legal future. Yet he remained acutely aware of the fragility of this arrangement. The alliance with authorities was pragmatic, not based on trust or friendship. Public perception, political shifts, or bureaucratic changes could easily alter the terms. Salvatore continued to balance caution with engagement, ensuring that his influence remained intact even as circumstances evolved. The collaboration also offered insights into the limitations of his influence. Authority outside the underworld operated on different principles: bureaucracy, procedure, and accountability to public perception constrained actions that would have been simple on the street. Salvatore adapted, translating his knowledge of systems and human behavior into this new context with careful precision. The moment Salvatore Lucania stepped onto foreign soil after deportation was unlike anything he had experienced before. He had been a man who thrived on networks, on influence, on invisible threads that connected people and events across the city and the country. And suddenly, all of that was stripped away. Italy, the land of his birth, was foreign and familiar at the same time. Streets he had never walked intersected with cultural memory, creating a strange dissonance that only reinforced the gravity of exile. For a man whose life had been measured by control, planning, and subtlety, this was a test of endurance and adaptation unlike any he had faced. Deportation was not merely a relocation, it was an enforced detachment from the very systems that had defined his existence. The empire he had built in New York continued to function without him, but he was now relegated to the periphery, dependent on reports, intermediaries, and fragments of information. The power he wielded through the commission, the alliances, and the carefully balanced networks was no longer immediately actionable. For the first time, he had to operate at a distance without the same certainty that his decisions would be implemented as intended. Italy offered both refuge and constraint. The post-war landscape was complex, politically charged, and unstable. Salvatore had to navigate a society reshaped by decades of war, dictatorship, and social upheaval. Authority in the cities was inconsistent, and local organizations varied widely in their discipline, reliability, and ambition. The underworld he once mastered in New York operated on different principles here. Alliances were less formalized, loyalties were localized, and his reputation, while recognized, carried little structural weight. Yet Salvatore's mind remained active. He began analyzing the Italian landscape with the same strategic eye that had served him in America. He mapped influential figures, potential allies, and possible threats. He observed labor structures, local businesses, and the emerging political order. He assessed which existing organizations could be integrated into broader plans and which were too volatile to rely upon. Adaptation was critical, and though his sphere of influence was limited, the principles of coordination, observation, and measured action remained constant. Isolation had its own advantages. In New York, Salvatore had been surrounded by expectation, by surveillance, by a constant need to maintain appearances. In Italy, he could move quietly, consider his options, and strategize without immediate threat from rivals or law enforcement. Yet this solitude also carried psychological weight. Decisions he could influence were often delayed by distance and communication challenges, and the consequences of misjudgment were magnified by the inability to intervene directly. Despite these limitations, Salvatore sought to maintain connections with his American network. Trusted intermediaries relayed information, allowing him to offer guidance on ongoing operations. He analyzed reports with the same meticulous care as if he were physically present. Strategic adjustments were made, minor conflicts resolved, and long-term planning continued, though always filtered through the limitations of distance. His influence persisted, but it was now exercised indirectly, relying heavily on the systems he had created to operate without his constant oversight. Life in Italy also required Salvatore to navigate cultural nuances and social hierarchies that differed from what he had mastered in New York. The Sicilian Mafia and other regional criminal networks operated with strict local codes, often emphasizing lineage, territory, and tradition more than efficiency or profit. Salvatore understood that imposing American-style strategies overtly would be met with resistance, so he adopted a more observational role, offering counsel and suggestions while assessing the potential for integration over time. The psychological impact of deportation was also profound. Salvatore was acutely aware that his presence in New York had become symbolic, both within the underworld and to law enforcement. While the systems he built functioned, he had become a distant figure, a legend in absentia. This shift required a recalibration of ambition. Direct control was no longer possible, and influence now depended on patience, foresight, and the careful cultivation of intermediaries. In private reflection, Salvatore considered the irony of exile. The man who had orchestrated complex networks, avoided direct confrontation when unnecessary, and maintained stability through subtle authority now had to operate from a position of enforced restraint. Yet even in this constrained environment, he saw opportunities. Distance allowed him to observe the evolution of the American underworld without the immediate pressures of daily management. Trends, conflicts, and potential vulnerabilities became clearer when viewed from afar, and he began developing strategies that might allow him to exert influence in the future, should circumstances permit. Italy also forced Salvatore to confront the limitations of reputation. In New York, his name carried weight, his reputation both shielded him and facilitated cooperation. In exile, that same reputation was fragmented. Among local criminal organizations, he was known, but not authoritative. Among authorities, he was simply an American gangster returned to his homeland. This duality required careful navigation. He had to leverage recognition without overstepping, offering advice that carried wisdom rather than presumption. Over time, Salvatore explored avenues for influence beyond traditional criminal operations. He considered investments, international connections, and opportunities to broker alliances between Italian and American networks. The Havana of the late 1930s and early 1940s, for example, loomed as a potential future theater for expansion. These considerations required patience, as political instability, international relations, and law enforcement pressures made direct intervention risky. Salvatore also reflected on the personal cost of exile. The life he had built, the authority he wielded, and the systems he had designed were all connected to the environment he had left behind. Distance highlighted both the fragility and resilience of these systems. He understood that power, even when carefully structured, could not be entirely maintained through reputation alone. Systems had to adapt, allies had to remain loyal, and strategy had to be continuously refined. Yet exile offered clarity. Freed from the constant demands of day-to-day operations, Salvatore could observe, analyze, and anticipate in ways he could not have in New York. The American underworld continued to evolve without him, revealing the strength of the structures he had put in place. At the same time, he could study Italian networks, assess potential collaborations, and consider long-term strategies for influence across borders. As years passed, Salvatore adjusted to the rhythm of exile. His life was quieter, slower, and more contemplative. He maintained connections, offered guidance, and prepared for eventual opportunities, all while understanding the limitations imposed upon him. The world he had shaped in New York continued to operate, now resilient enough to survive his physical absence, yet still subtly guided by the principles he had instilled. In Italy, Salvatore Lucania became a man defined by observation, strategy, and patience. Though physically removed from the empire he had built, his mind remained engaged, his influence persistent, and his understanding of systems deeper than ever. Exile was not merely a punishment, it was a test of adaptability, foresight, and resilience. And in this test, Salvatore continued to navigate the complex interplay of power, distance, and opportunity, ensuring that even in absence, his legacy endured. Even in exile, Salvatore Lucania's ambitions did not fade. Distance could limit immediate control, but it could not extinguish vision. By the late 1930s, the world beyond Italy's shores presented new opportunities, and one of the most promising lay in Havana, Cuba. The city pulsed with potential, a tropical hub where money, influence, and vice intersected with a laissez-faire tolerance that the American system could never replicate. For a strategist like Salvatore, it represented both risk and reward, a laboratory in which his ideas about organized crime could be tested on an international stage. Havana was a city of contrasts. Glittering casinos and luxury hotels sat alongside poverty-stricken neighborhoods, while ports hummed with ships carrying everything from sugar to spirits. Corruption seeped through municipal and national institutions alike, creating a space where well-connected operators could thrive. Salvatore understood the mechanics immediately. Success here depended not on brute force but on negotiation, influence, and subtle orchestration. He began by establishing contacts with local criminal figures, labor leaders, and business operators. These initial alliances were cautious, exploratory. Havana was far from New York, and the networks that governed it operated under different cultural codes. Trust could not be assumed, it had to be earned through demonstration of reliability, discretion, and strategic insight. Salvatore offered guidance and coordination without asserting overt control, allowing local actors to maintain face while gradually aligning their operations with his broader objectives. At the same time, Salvatore monitored developments in the United States. Though deported, he remained a figure of influence. Allies and intermediaries kept him informed of the American underworld's dynamics, ensuring that he could exploit opportunities that bridged the two hemispheres. This dual perspective, local immersion in Havana coupled with insight into New York's ongoing operations, allowed him to act with a level of foresight few rivals could match. Salvatore's approach to Havana mirrored his philosophy, structure and coordination over chaos and spectacle. He identified profitable ventures, mapped routes for gambling and bootlegging operations, and established protocols for dispute resolution. He insisted on discreet enforcement, minimizing violence to maintain stability and avoid drawing attention from authorities. The city's fluid social and political environment required flexibility, and Salvatore adapted, blending diplomacy with strategic assertiveness. Yet challenges arose almost immediately. Local operators were wary of outsiders, especially someone with Salvatore's reputation. Havana was already fragmented, with factions vying for territory, profit, and influence. Missteps could provoke violent conflicts, undermine credibility, or draw unwanted attention from government authorities. Salvatore navigated these dynamics with the same patience and observation that had guided him in New York. He allowed relationships to develop slowly, demonstrating competence and reliability without appearing threatening. The Havana Conference, which would later gain legendary status, became a focal point for these efforts. Salvatore convened key figures from the American and Cuban underworlds, carefully balancing interests and personalities. The goal was not domination, but coordination, a mechanism to align activities, prevent conflict, and maximize profit. Negotiations were delicate, requiring not only tactical acumen but a deep understanding of human behavior. Salvatore's skill in reading motivations, predicting reactions, and shaping outcomes proved invaluable. However, even the best-laid plans faced obstacles. Cuban politics were unpredictable, and law enforcement was inconsistent. Economic fluctuations affected cash flow, and rival factions constantly tested alliances. Salvatore quickly learned that distance, culture, and shifting loyalties amplified risk. Every decision carried consequences that could not be reversed immediately, and miscalculation could erode trust built over months. Internally, the challenge was equally complex. Salvatore's network relied on intermediaries and trusted lieutenants to implement directives from afar. Coordination across borders required communication that was often slow, unreliable, and prone to misinterpretation. Misaligned incentives could disrupt operations, and Salvatore had to manage these vulnerabilities while preserving authority without direct enforcement. Despite these difficulties, the Havana period reinforced lessons Salvatore had long understood. Power was most enduring when exercised through systems rather than force. Trust had to be cultivated and maintained carefully. Discipline, observation, and adaptability were more effective than intimidation or spectacle. Havana offered a vivid illustration. Success depended not on dominance but on the ability to align diverse interests under a shared framework. Salvatore also observed the limits of his influence. Cultural norms, political instability, and local rivalries constrained what he could achieve. Unlike New York, where systems had been built over decades, Havana required constant recalibration. Some ventures flourished, others faltered despite careful planning. The experience highlighted that even the most intelligent and disciplined operator must adapt to local conditions, and that ambition alone cannot guarantee success. Emotionally, the Havana period was bittersweet. Salvatore was far from the empire he had built, yet he remained active, engaged, and strategically relevant. The experience demanded patience and humility, reminding him that control was not absolute and that even a master strategist could encounter limits imposed by geography, politics, and human unpredictability. The eventual collapse of some of his Havana ambitions was a sober lesson. Political pressures, changing alliances, and unexpected enforcement actions disrupted operations he had meticulously planned. While some ventures continued successfully, others unraveled, demonstrating the fragility of influence when removed from direct control. By the time Salvatore Lucania returned to the United States, the landscape of organized crime had shifted yet again. Years of exile, imprisonment, and strategic maneuvering had tested the resilience of the empire he had built. New faces had emerged, old alliances had evolved, and the systems he had once guided directly were now functioning with a degree of autonomy. For Salvatore, reintegration was not a simple matter of reclaiming control. It was a delicate exercise in observation, adaptation, and subtle assertion. Returning was both a triumph and a challenge. He had been absent during pivotal years when power had flowed and realignments had occurred. Many figures he once influenced had grown accustomed to autonomy, and some had expanded their authority beyond what he had envisioned. Salvatore knew that any overt attempt to dominate could provoke resentment or destabilize the very system he had spent decades constructing. Instead, he relied on discretion, patience, and the quiet assertion of authority that had always defined his style. The city greeted him with familiar rhythms, the hum of traffic, the clatter of factories, the distant echo of waterfront activity, but beneath this normalcy lay a transformed criminal landscape. Territories had been contested, leadership structures adjusted, and alliances recalibrated. Salvatore spent the first months reacquainting himself with operations, reviewing reports from trusted intermediaries, and assessing which networks remained stable and which required intervention. His re-entry was not marked by public displays or announcements. Salvatore understood that visibility invited danger, not influence. Instead, he moved methodically, engaging with key figures individually, evaluating their loyalty, competence, and willingness to cooperate. He observed without demanding, listened without interrupting, and allowed others to demonstrate the value of their continued alignment with his vision. One of the immediate challenges he encountered was the evolution of the commission he had originally helped establish. While the system still functioned, individual families and factions had interpreted its rules differently. Some had become more assertive, others more cautious, and a few had sought to exploit ambiguities for personal gain. Salvatore addressed these issues with careful diplomacy, clarifying principles without creating the impression of dictating authority. His influence relied on respect, not coercion. Financially, the operations he returned to were more diversified than ever. Gambling, labor racketeering, and other enterprises continued to generate substantial revenue, and the organization had expanded into new markets. Salvatore's insight was critical in evaluating which ventures were sustainable and which required adjustment. He applied the same analytical rigor that had guided his planning in New York, Havana, and even within the walls of prison: systematic assessment, risk evaluation, and strategic adaptation. Rebuilding influence also required managing personal relationships. Many associates had matured, accumulated their own authority, and tested their autonomy in his absence. Salvatore approached these dynamics with patience. He cultivated alliances, rewarded loyalty, and mitigated potential rivalries quietly. By demonstrating competence and foresight rather than issuing commands, he reasserted authority without provoking unnecessary conflict. Salvatore's return coincided with a broader societal context that demanded subtlety. Law enforcement, aware of his history, observed his movements closely. The public narrative framed him as a powerful figure from a previous era, even as the reality of operations had become more nuanced. Salvatore understood that overt action would attract scrutiny, and that maintaining discretion was essential to long-term stability. He also observed generational shifts within the underworld. Younger figures were ambitious, impatient, and eager to assert themselves. While some lacked the strategic perspective he had cultivated over decades, their energy and initiative were assets if properly channeled. Salvatore invested in mentorship, guiding emerging leaders in negotiation, risk assessment, and systemic thinking, ensuring that the underlying structure he had designed continued to function effectively. Coordination across regions remained a hallmark of his strategy. The lessons learned in New York, Havana, and prison reinforced the importance of decentralized authority, careful communication, and consensus-driven decision-making. Salvatore refined protocols for inter-family cooperation, dispute resolution, and resource allocation, balancing autonomy with oversight. The result was a network that remained resilient while still adaptable to emerging challenges. The psychological aspect of reintegration was significant. Salvatore had been accustomed to being central to the flow of influence. Returning to a landscape where systems operated without him required humility, observation, and patience. He accepted that influence would be gradual, earned through subtle guidance rather than immediate assertion. This approach reinforced his philosophy that durable power was systemic, not personal. Salvatore also navigated new legal pressures. Authorities had adapted since his last period of direct influence, employing sophisticated investigative techniques, surveillance, and financial scrutiny. His strategy emphasized minimizing exposure, using intermediaries, and ensuring that operational control remained insulated from potential legal vulnerabilities. This precautionary approach maintained both continuity and security. Over time, Salvatore re-established himself as a central figure, though always quietly. Decisions flowed through him indirectly, conflicts were resolved under his guidance, and long-term strategic planning reflected his insights. He did not dominate through fear or spectacle, he dominated through expertise, foresight, and the credibility of a lifetime of consistent judgment. The impact of his return was evident across the underworld. Stability increased, conflicts diminished, and operations became more predictable. Salvatore Lucania's journey, from a boy navigating the streets of New York's Lower East Side to the architect of the American Mafia, ultimately culminates in a legacy defined not by spectacle, violence, or flamboyance, but by structure, strategy, and subtle influence. In the final years of his life, the full measure of his impact becomes apparent, not in headlines or sensationalized accounts, but in the enduring systems that continued to govern organized crime long after he had stepped away from direct oversight. His life, shaped by exile, incarceration, and strategic mastery, reflects a rare form of power, one exercised invisibly yet decisively, shaping behavior and outcomes without drawing unnecessary attention to the man behind it. By this stage, Salvatore had perfected what few before him understood: true authority does not require visibility. While younger gangsters often sought notoriety and personal dominance, Salvatore's genius lay in restraint. He had demonstrated repeatedly that influence could be exercised through systems rather than intimidation, through alliances rather than ego, and through foresight rather than impulse. The Mafia, under his guidance, evolved from a collection of volatile street crews into a coordinated, resilient network capable of enduring internal tensions, external threats, and the constant pressures of law enforcement. His legacy is perhaps most clearly seen in the Commission, the body he helped establish after the removal of Mafia and Maranzano. It was not a council designed for personal glorification, but for governance, dispute resolution, territorial coordination, and oversight of profitable ventures. Its enduring structure, and the compliance it commanded, reflected Salvatore's philosophy: stability is more valuable than chaos, cooperation more enduring than coercion. The Commission allowed organized crime to function with the efficiency of a corporation while remaining largely insulated from external scrutiny. In doing so, it institutionalized a set of rules and practices that would persist for decades, providing a blueprint for generations to follow. Even in exile, Salvatore maintained an influence that underscored the durability of systems over individuals. Whether observing the evolution of New York's underworld from Italy or testing his principles in Havana, he demonstrated that his strategies were portable and resilient. These ventures highlighted the adaptability of his approach. While specific operations might fluctuate with local conditions, the underlying principles, coordinated communication, strategic alliances, controlled enforcement, and decentralized authority, remained applicable across contexts and borders. His ability to guide operations indirectly, without the need for physical presence, reinforced the notion that true leadership is exercised through planning, insight, and the careful cultivation of trust. Throughout his life, Salvatore also exemplified the intersection of pragmatism and ethics, though within the morally ambiguous world of organized crime. He rarely sought unnecessary violence, recognizing that stability, predictability, and profit were more valuable than retribution or spectacle. Loyalty, in his system, was not blind obedience enforced through fear, it was a calculated exchange, where adherence to agreed-upon rules produced mutual benefit. Those who broke trust were managed carefully, often isolated rather than subjected to gratuitous violence, reflecting a consistent strategic logic rather than impulsive vengeance. The broader implications of his approach extended beyond criminal operations. Salvatore demonstrated that intelligence, patience, and systemic thinking could manipulate environments to achieve objectives that brute force alone could not. This principle, tested in New York, prison, Havana, and during wartime collaboration with authorities, revealed that influence is most enduring when it relies on foresight, coordination, and adaptability. He operated in multiple contexts simultaneously, assessing political, social, and economic landscapes to optimize outcomes, a skill that made him uniquely effective and respected, even among rivals. Salvatore's interactions with government authorities during World War II further exemplify this lesson. By leveraging his networks to secure strategic operations at ports and shipping lines, he demonstrated that his expertise in organized coordination could serve purposes beyond illicit gain. The same principles that guided his criminal empire, observation, trust, calculation, and systemic planning, proved invaluable in a legal and national security context. This period illustrated that the qualities defining his influence were transferable and not inherently tied to illegality. It was his vision and capacity for organization that mattered most. Personal life and relationships, while often constrained by the demands of his work, also reflected his disciplined approach. Salvatore cultivated alliances carefully, nurturing loyalty without dependency, balancing distance and engagement. He avoided the pitfalls of ego-driven dominance, instead emphasizing outcomes over recognition. This strategy ensured that even as public attention highlighted sensational figures, the underlying networks remained intact, guided by principles he had instilled over decades. In doing so, he protected both his personal safety and the long-term stability of the organizations he influenced. The narrative of Salvatore Lucania's life is also a story of adaptability. From the streets of Brooklyn to the power vacuums created by Mafia and Maranzano, from exile in Italy to operations in Havana, and finally to a strategic return to New York, he consistently adjusted to evolving circumstances. Challenges that might have undone less disciplined figures, deportation, imprisonment, legal scrutiny, and political change, were navigated with foresight and patience. This adaptability not only preserved his influence but reinforced the durability of the structures he had built, demonstrating that leadership is as much about anticipating change as it is about commanding it. In reflecting on Salvatore's life, it becomes clear that his greatest achievement was the creation of enduring systems. Unlike others whose influence relied on fear, visibility, or personal charisma, Salvatore's power derived from design, foresight, and discipline. He understood that individuals are transient, but systems endure. By embedding principles of order, negotiation, and accountability into the framework of organized crime, he ensured that his influence would outlast personal presence, physical capacity, and even lifespan. This insight, perhaps the defining element of his legacy, transformed organized crime from a chaotic, personality-driven enterprise into a structured, resilient network capable of withstanding internal and external pressures. Even as death approached, Salvatore's mind remained engaged with the abstract architecture of power. He reflected on lessons learned, the importance of observation, the necessity of patience, the value of decentralized authority, and the enduring strength of trust-based relationships.